Welcome, welcome. You're here at Arcane Paradox. Today we present to you, St Mungo's healer found 71 starvation charms on Harry age 6 and Goblin King invaded Britain. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The 71. The school nurse at St Giles Primary had seen plenty of children faint before. Heat, hunger, the occasional dramatic reaction to a spelling test, she'd catalogued them all in 22 years behind that desk. But the boy on the floor of the Year 2 corridor wasn't fainting the way children fainted. He'd simply stopped, like a clock someone had reached into and stilled with their bare hand, and the air around him was doing something that made her fillings ache. She called 999. The ambulance came in 6 minutes. He arrived at Whittington Hospital at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and the moment the automatic doors slid shut behind the paramedics, every piece of electronic equipment in the A&E wing flickered, surged, and half of them died entirely. The cardiac monitors flatlined simultaneously. The defibrillator in Bay 3 discharged into nothing. A junior doctor later described feeling the hair on her arms stand straight up, the way it did before a lightning strike, except the feeling didn't pass. It lasted 4 hours. The Muggle doctors found nothing clinically wrong. His vitals, once they got equipment close enough to read them, were strange but stable. No fever. No trauma. No identifiable cause. What they did find, what the admitting nurse wrote in her notes with increasing uncertainty, was that the child was severely, chronically malnourished in ways that didn't track with his otherwise apparently healthy presentation. His weight was wrong. His bone density was wrong. And there was something about his eyes when they finally opened, green, vivid, startlingly alert, that made 3 separate medical professionals go home that evening and hug their own children without quite being able to say why. The Ministry of Magic's Accidental Magic Reversal Squad got the alert at 11:52. The Muggle-Worthy Excuse Committee got it at 11:54 and immediately began drafting a cover story involving faulty electrical cabling. But the third alert, the one that went to St Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, that one was flagged differently. Because the signature attached to the magical field radiating off the unconscious boy wasn't a child's accidental magic. It was structured. Layered. Ancient in the way that things become ancient not through age but through deliberate, patient construction. The duty healer at St Mungo's who received the alert was Miriam Voss, and she read it twice before she put her tea down, picked up her diagnostic satchel, and told her Medowitch to cancel her afternoon appointments. She found him at 2:15 p.m., still unconscious, in a side room they'd moved him to when he kept interfering with the main ward's equipment. The Muggle nurse sitting with him looked exhausted and slightly haunted, and she gave Voss exactly the kind of look that Muggle medical professionals gave ministry officials, half grateful, half deeply suspicious, before being guided out of the room by a memory charm wearing the face of a hospital administrator. Miriam closed the door and cast the standard diagnostic first. Revelio Medicalis, second-year Healer's Academy, the spell that showed her the shape of a patient's magical core the way an X-ray showed bone. She'd cast it roughly 8,000 times in her career. The result was nothing like anything she'd seen in 20 years of practice. The boy's magical core was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer size of it, burning in her diagnostic display like a star behind cloud cover, something vast and hot and barely contained. But the cloud cover was the point, because wrapped around that core, layer upon layer upon layer, were constructions that her display was struggling to even categorize. They looked, at first glance, like standard suppression work. The kind of thing you occasionally found on children from families with complicated magical histories, usually poorly applied, usually accidental. She started counting. She was at 30 when she sat down on the edge of the plastic chair beside his bed. She was at 50 when she realized her hands were shaking. At 71 she stopped, because there were no more, not because she'd missed any, she'd checked 3 times, and she sat in the thin afternoon light of a Muggle hospital side room and looked at the face of a 6-year-old boy who was sleeping so deeply he might have been underwater, and she thought about what 71 deliberate, layered, sustained starvation charms meant for a human body. What they did over time. How much energy they siphoned. How, in a child with a magical core the size of this child's, the body would compensate, pulling nutrition from wherever it could, the magic always eating first, always hungry, always draining. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she opened her satchel, took out her documentation scroll, and began writing in the careful, precise hand that 20 years of medical records had given her. She wrote everything. She dated every charm by the magical residue signature, which told her roughly when each one had been applied. The first cluster, 7 of them, woven together in a way that suggested professional training, dated to approximately 5 years ago. The rest had been added in irregular intervals, layered over the old ones, reinforcing and expanding. Someone had been maintaining these. Checking in. Adding more when the original work began to degrade. This wasn't neglect. You couldn't accidentally cast 71 starvation charms on a child. You couldn't accidentally maintain them. She was halfway through the documentation when the boy opened his eyes. He looked at her without any of the confusion that children usually showed coming out of magical episodes. No disorientation, no grabbing for familiar faces. He just looked at her, those green eyes taking her in with an attention that felt distinctly adult, and then he looked around the room with the same calm assessment, and then he looked back at her. "You're not a regular doctor," he said. His voice was small, he was 6, and clearly hadn't eaten properly in what her records were now suggesting was his entire life, but it was steady. "No," Miriam said. "I'm a different kind. My name is Healer Voss." "What's yours?" "Harry," he said. And then, watching her face, "You found something." It wasn't a question. Miriam had been a healer long enough to know that lying to patients, even very small patients, was both ethically wrong and practically useless. They always knew. "Yes," she said. "I did." Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his own hands, which were lying on top of the thin hospital blanket, and Miriam watched something cross his face, not pain, exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone putting a name to a thing they'd felt for a long time without language for it. "Is that why I'm always hungry?" he asked. Miriam's pen stopped moving. "Yes," she said, when she trusted her voice again. "That's exactly why." He nodded, slow and serious, the way children nodded when adults confirmed something they'd already decided was true. Then he looked back up at her, and there was something in his expression that wasn't grief or fear or even anger. It was more like the moment before a decision. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "I already started," Miriam said. "But it's going to take some time, and I need to ask you some questions first, Harry. Is that all right?" "Okay," he said. "And then, will my aunt and uncle find out?" The way he said it, neutral, toneless, the way you'd ask about the weather when you already knew it was going to rain, told Miriam more than the charms had. "Yes," she said carefully. "Some people will need to be told. Including some people from my world. The magical world." He processed that. "You're a witch," he said. "I am." "Am I?" He stopped. Started again. "Aunt Petunia says I'm not. She says there's nothing special about me." The fury that moved through Miriam Voss at that moment was cold and very clean, the kind that doesn't burn itself out quickly. She kept her face professional and her voice level. "Your aunt," she said, "is wrong about that. Among other things." Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened, something small, something that Miriam suspected he had no conscious control over, and the temperature in the room went up by approximately 4 degrees, and the dead monitoring equipment on the wall flickered back to life, every screen, all at once. "Okay," Harry said, with the particular satisfaction of someone filing information away for later. "I believe you." She removed 14 of the 71 charms before she ran out of both time and the appropriate counter-curse components she'd have to source properly from the hospital's locked stores. 14 was enough to notice. The color came back into Harry's face like a tide coming in. He sat up straighter. He looked at the sandwich the nurse had left on the bedside table, ham and cheese, slightly curled at the edges, and ate the entire thing in under 2 minutes, and then looked at her with an expression that managed to be both satisfied and faintly apologetic. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," Miriam said. "I'll get you more." She got him more. She watched him eat with the focused efficiency of a person who had never had the luxury of tasting food, and she completed her documentation, and then she stepped outside into the corridor and made 2 calls on her ministry-issue communications mirror. The first was to St Mungo's, to arrange emergency transfer and a private ward. The second was to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and she asked specifically for Amelia Bones, and when the mirror connected and Amelia's square, no-nonsense face appeared, Miriam held up her documentation scroll and said, "Madam Bones, I need you to clear your afternoon. I'm at Whittington Hospital in Muggle, London. I have Harry Potter in a side room, and I need to read you the contents of this report before it goes through official channels, because once it does, I don't think either of us is going to have a quiet day for a very long time." Amelia Bones was not a woman who showed alarm easily. Her face barely moved. But her eyes sharpened to a point. "How bad?" she said. Miriam thought about 71 charms. She thought about the dating signatures. She thought about the word maintained. "Worse than that," she said. "I'll see you in an hour." Amelia arrived in 50 minutes. She came in Muggle clothes, navy suit, sensible shoes, briefcase that was definitely not a briefcase, accompanied by a single Auror who positioned himself in the corridor outside Harry's room with the careful stillness of someone trained to look like furniture. She read Miriam's report standing up, without sitting down, without asking for clarification, without making a sound. When she finished she read it again. Then she set it on the bedside table and looked at Harry, who had been watching her the entire time with those extraordinary eyes, calm as deep water. "Hello, Harry," she said. "Hello," he said. "You're important." Amelia's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "I try to be. Does anything hurt?" "Everything hurts," Harry said, in the same tone you'd use to say it's a bit cloudy out. "But less than before." Healer Voss took some of them off. "Some," Amelia repeated, and looked at Miriam. 14, Miriam said. "I'll remove the rest properly once he's transferred to St Mungo's. But I wanted you here first. Before the transfer, before the official filing, before," she paused. "Before Albus Dumbledore finds out his name is in this report." The silence in the room changed. Harry looked between them. He didn't know the name. Not yet. He filed it anyway. Miriam could see him doing it, storing it in whatever internal archive those green eyes pointed to. "The oldest charm cluster," Amelia said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the report. "You dated it to approximately 5 years ago. The residue signature is consistent with application when Harry was approximately 12 to 14 months old," Miriam said. "Give or take 3 months for dating variance. He was placed with the Dursleys at 15 months, Amelia said. "Yes," Miriam said. Another silence. "The signature," Amelia said. "The professional construction of the original cluster. Can you characterize it?" "It's very clean work," Miriam said carefully. "Whoever applied the original 7 had high-level training in constructive charm work and a deep familiarity with magical core architecture. The precision is, it's not standard. It's not the kind of thing you learn from a textbook. It's the kind of thing you learn from decades of experience," Amelia said. "Yes." Amelia picked up her briefcase. She looked at Harry one more time, this strange, thin, electric child who was eating his 3rd sandwich and watching them both with the attention of someone memorizing a map. "File the report," she said to Miriam. "Use the Priority 1 designation. I want it on every senior healer's desk at St Mungo's by 6 o'clock. And I want a copy held separately, physically, not in the ministry filing system, until I tell you otherwise." She turned toward the door. I'm going to make some visits. To whom? Miriam asked. Amelia paused with her hand on the door. The Dursleys. And then Dumbledore. She said both names with the same flat precision, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself for anything. What do I tell Harry? Miriam asked. Amelia looked back at the boy. He'd finished his sandwich and was sitting with his knees pulled up, watching them both with that disconcerting steadiness. Tell him, Amelia said, that the people responsible will be answering for it. And tell him that's not a maybe. She left. The aura in the corridor fell into step behind her. Miriam listened to their footsteps recede and then turned back to Harry, who was looking at the door they'd gone through with an expression she couldn't entirely read. She means it, Miriam told him. I know, Harry said. She's angry. People who are actually angry are the ones who do things. He paused. The ones who just seem angry usually don't. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. 6 years old. 12 to 14 months when the first charms went on. 5 years of living in a body that was perpetually being starved of everything it needed, and here he was sorting adults into categories of reliability with the calm precision of someone who had needed to learn that skill very young to survive. Let's get you transferred to St Mungo's, she said. There's a ward there that's much more comfortable than this. And a proper kitchen. Harry's face did something then. The calculation dropped out of it, just for a second, and underneath was something younger and more transparent, a 6-year-old who had just been told there was a kitchen, and Miriam made a private, ironclad decision that whoever had put those charms on this child was going to feel the full weight of every one of them before she was done. The transfer took 2 hours, the cover story for the Muggle hospital staff took another 40 minutes, and by the time Harry was settled in a private room on the 4th floor of St Mungo's, the magical reversal ward, which had proper shielding for a magical field this volatile, the report had gone out. It hit the senior healers at 5:47 p.m. By 6:30 it had been copied, unofficially, by someone with access to internal olery and a deep and personal distaste for institutional suppression, and was moving through the hands of half a dozen people who were not on the official distribution list. By 7 o'clock someone had sent a copy to the Daily Prophet's investigative desk, though nothing would appear in print for another 18 hours. By 8 o'clock Miriam had received 14 owls, 2 Patronus messages, and 1 visitor she hadn't called. Albus Dumbledore arrived at St Mungo's at 8:14 p.m. He looked, Miriam thought, exactly like his portraits, silver-haired and stately, the half-moon spectacles, the long fingers and the careful walk of a man who was always aware of the space he occupied in a room. He was wearing deep blue robes with astronomical embroidery and he smiled at her in the corridor outside Harry's room with the particular warmth of someone who was accustomed to warmth working on people. It didn't work on Miriam. She'd been thinking about 71 charms for 8 hours, and thinking had done nothing to improve her opinion of them. Healer Voss, he said, his voice carrying that famous depth. I came as soon as I heard. I understand there's been a development concerning young Harry. Several developments, Miriam said. Would you like to discuss them here in the corridor, or would you prefer to step into the consultation room? Something shifted in his eyes, something very small, very controlled. He chose the consultation room. She closed the door behind them. There was a table, 2 chairs, a standard healer's recording lamp on the wall, the kind that noted the time and the participants of any consultation held within the room. Dumbledore looked at it. He knew what it was. Please, Miriam said, gesturing to the chair. She didn't sit down herself. I'll be direct, headmaster, because I'm tired and I want to get back to my patient. Of course, he said. I found 71 charms on Harry Potter's magical core today. Starvation charms, suppression hexes, and a foundational binding on his core's growth node that, I'm aware, Dumbledore said. The room went very quiet. Miriam looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without shifting, without doing any of the things people did when they were surprised. He sat in the chair with his hands folded on the table and he looked at her with those famous blue eyes and he said, "I'm aware," and the recording lamp on the wall noted the time. "You're aware," Miriam said, and her voice was entirely level because she had decided the moment he sat down that she would not give him the satisfaction of her anger. "You're aware that there are 71 active charms on a 6-year-old boy's magical core. That the original cluster was applied when he was approximately 14 months old. That someone has been maintaining and adding to that cluster for the past 5 years. You're aware of that." "I was aware that certain protective measures were in place," Dumbledore said. "I was not aware that the number had become so," he paused. "Extensive. I will need to speak with the individual responsible for the maintenance." "Who is that individual?" Miriam asked. "I'm afraid that's a sensitive matter." "I'm afraid," Miriam said, "that it's a matter for the DMLE, and I've already briefed Amelia Bones, and I'm afraid that my report has been officially filed with Priority 1 designation and 3 copies are held in locations outside the Ministry filing system, so if you are considering asking me not to pursue this formally, I would save the conversation." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He looked at his folded hands. "Healer Voss," he said, and his voice was still warm, but there was something under it now, a bedrock of certainty that had nothing to do with warmth. "I understand how this must appear. And I want you to know that Harry's well-being has always been my primary concern. The measures in place were designed, however inadequately they were ultimately maintained, to protect him. There are forces in our world, with respect, Headmaster," Miriam said, and she did not try to make it sound respectful. "I didn't ask you about forces in your world. I asked you who has been applying charms to a child's body without his knowledge or consent, and maintaining those charms for 5 years while that child's physical development was compromised in 17 distinct categories that I can enumerate from my diagnostic findings if you'd like." A long pause. "Harry is safe," Dumbledore said. "Harry collapsed in a school corridor this morning," Miriam said. "His body, which has been starved of nutrition by active magical interference for the entirety of his conscious life, hit a threshold it could not sustain. He is not safe. He has never been safe. He was placed in a home where the people responsible for his care were not only aware of the charm's existence but appear from my initial assessment to have cooperated with or actively facilitated. That is a serious accusation." "It is a serious finding," Miriam said. "And I have documented it thoroughly. If you have information that would contextualize it differently, I'm listening. But you should know that I am listening as a St Mungo's healer with a legal obligation to report, not as someone who can be talked into a different conclusion." Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. Those blue eyes were still warm, still patient, still doing the thing they did that made people feel held and considered. Miriam stared back and thought about the dating signatures on the charm clusters. "May I see him?" Dumbledore said. "No," Miriam said. Something moved across his face. Just for a moment, something that wasn't surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it. He wasn't accustomed to that word from people in rooms like this. "He is in my care," Miriam said. "I am his healer of record from this point forward. Visitors require both his consent and mine. I have not established whether he knows who you are, and until I've had the opportunity to assess his emotional and psychological state more fully, I'm not introducing any new variables." "I see," Dumbledore said. He uncurled from the chair, standing slowly in the way of very tall, very old men, and he was still doing that thing, projecting the warmth, the benevolence, the immovable sense of "I know what's best," but it was landing differently now because the recording lamp was on and Miriam hadn't sat down and she had 71 documented charms and Amelia Bones on her communications mirror. "I trust," he said, "that you will keep me informed of Harry's progress." "The DMLE will keep you informed," Miriam said, "of whatever they determine you should know." He left. Miriam stood in the consultation room for 30 seconds after the door closed, breathing carefully, and then she walked back to Harry's room. He was awake. It was after 9 p.m. and he should have been asleep, but he was sitting up in the bed, a proper hospital bed with proper linen and 3 blankets because Miriam had noticed he kept pulling them tighter, and he was looking at the window, where the lights of nighttime London made yellow halos in the dark. "Someone came," he said, without turning around. "Someone important to someone." The nurses got nervous. "How did you know?" "The magic changed," he said, simply. "There's a lot of it around here, and he frowned, searching for words. "It sort of moved. Like when a big thing walks through water. Everything ripples." Miriam sat down in the chair beside his bed. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones, but she wasn't going anywhere. She'd told the night shift Medowitch she'd be staying, and she'd meant it. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said. "Yes. The things you took off today. Will you take the rest of them off?" "Yes. Tomorrow, and over the next few days. We have to go carefully because my magic will change," Harry said. "When you take something off, there's more space. It's like I've been breathing through something very small, and when you took those 14 off, it got bigger. And my magic noticed." He looked at his hands again. "It's going to notice more when you take the rest." Miriam chose her words with care. "That's right. We'll go at a pace that keeps you safe." "What will it do?" he asked. "When it has proper space." "We don't fully know," she said honestly. "We've never seen a core like yours. We'll figure it out together." Harry thought about that. He seemed to find it acceptable. "The man who came tonight," he said. "His name is Dumbledore." Miriam went still. "What makes you say that?" "The nurses. One of them said it under her breath in the corridor." He looked at her steadily. "He's the one who put me with my aunt and uncle, isn't he? He's the one who decided." There was no point in lying to him. She'd already established that, back in the Muggle hospital at 2:15 in the afternoon. "Yes," she said. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the window. "I thought so," he said. There was nothing in his voice, no hatred, no tears, nothing that Miriam could hold on to as a manageable emotion. Just the same clean clarity he'd had all day, the look of someone filing information in the right drawer. "Harry," she said, and she waited until he looked at her. "What was done to you was wrong. It was deliberate and it was sustained, and the people responsible will be answering for it. Do you understand what I mean when I say answering for it?" "They'll be in trouble," Harry said. "More than trouble." He considered this with the gravity of someone who understood that more than trouble had weight. Then he lay back against the pillows, pulling the blankets up, and looked at the ceiling. "Healer Voss," he said. "You can call me Miriam," she said. A pause. As if the offer of a first name was something that required processing. "Miriam," he said. "I'm glad you were the one who found it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, St Mungo's hummed its nighttime hospital hum, footsteps, the soft percussion of healing spells, the distant murmur of a ward full of patients who had each arrived here broken in some way and were, most of them, on their way to being less broken. "So am I," she said. She stayed until he was asleep. It didn't take long, 14 charms removed and a body finally getting food and a bed with 3 blankets, sleep came quickly. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, listened to his breathing even out, and looked at the face of a child who had spent his entire life being deliberately diminished by people who were afraid of how large he would become. She picked up her documentation scroll. She had one more entry to make, and she made it in the same careful, precise hand as everything else. Consultation with APWB Dumbledore, 8:14 p.m. Subject confirmed awareness of charm presence. Subject declined to identify individual responsible for maintenance. No information provided that alters current findings or changes Priority 1 designation. Recommend immediate DMLE follow-up subject's involvement in initial charm application. M. Voss, Senior Healer, St Mungo's Hospital, Magical Reversal Ward. She sealed it with her healer's mark and sent it by internal owl to Amelia Bones's private office. Then she made a cup of tea in the small room at the end of the corridor, sat down with it, and began making a list of every counter-curse component she was going to need for tomorrow. 57 charms to go. She was going to need a lot of components. The Daily Prophet ran the story the next morning. Not the full report, whoever had leaked it had shown enough discretion to withhold the most sensitive documentation, but enough. Boy who lived found with dozens of dark charms, St Mungo's healer raises alarm. The headline was across the front page, and the subheading, in slightly smaller type, read, Ministry source confirms charms applied in infancy, Dursley family under investigation. By 7 a.m., there were witches and wizards in the street outside the Dursley house in Little Whinging. By 8 a.m., there were 50. By 9 a.m., the number was closer to 200, and they weren't carrying signs. They were standing in the quiet Muggle cul-de-sac in their robes and their ordinary clothes and their everything in between, and they were not shouting or throwing anything or doing what a mob does. They were just there, which was in some ways worse, because a mob you can disperse, but 200 witches and wizards standing in absolute, furious silence are a different kind of pressure entirely. Vernon Dursley, who had looked out the front window at 8:05 and gone the color of old chalk, had locked every door and was sitting at the kitchen table trying to pretend this was somehow a misunderstanding. Petunia Dursley was sitting across from him. She had been sitting there since 6 a.m., when the owl had arrived with the prophet, and she had read the headline and set the paper down on the table very carefully and had not moved since. She wasn't pretending anything. She was looking at the middle distance with an expression that Vernon couldn't interpret and didn't want to. 2 Aurors knocked on the door at 9:47 a.m. They were very polite about it. They showed their credentials. They explained that the Dursleys were required to present themselves to the ministry for questioning regarding the findings documented in Healer Voss's Priority 1 report. They used words like voluntary cooperation and preliminary interview that everyone present understood to mean something considerably less voluntary than advertised. Vernon said he wanted to call his solicitor. The Aurors said that was entirely his right. Petunia said nothing. She got her coat. She got her handbag. She walked. More actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 2, Ragnarok moves. The copy of Miriam Voss's report that reached Gringotts arrived at 11:23 p.m. on the same night Harry was admitted to St Mungo's, which meant it arrived approximately 9 hours before the Daily Prophet ran its headline and approximately 11 hours before Vernon Dursley went the color of old chalk. It arrived by a channel that had nothing to do with owls. Gringotts had its own information infrastructure, built over 8 centuries of financial intelligence, and it was considerably more sophisticated than anything the Ministry of Magic operated. The Goblins had learned, very early in their relationship with the wizarding world, that information was the only currency that never depreciated, and they had invested in its collection accordingly. They had sources in St Mungo's. They had sources in the DMLE. They had sources in the Prophet's Olary and the Wisengamot's administrative office and 3 separate departments of the ministry whose staff would have been mortified to know it. The report was on Ragnarok's desk before Miriam Voss had finished her tea. The office of the Goblin King occupied the deepest chamber of Gringotts, 6 levels below the lobby that tourists and wizarding customers saw when they pushed through the bank's bronze doors. It was not a room designed to impress visitors, because visitors were rarely invited. It was designed for work, a vast, low-ceilinged space carved from the same dark stone as the vaults, lit by globes of cold white light that hung from the ceiling without visible support, walls lined with filing cases that contained records going back to the bank's founding in 1474. The desk in the center was enormous and entirely clear of clutter, because Ragnarok did not allow clutter. Every document that arrived was read, assessed, and either filed or acted upon within the hour. He read Miriam Voss's report in 14 minutes. He was not a large creature by human standards, goblins rarely were, but there was something about Ragnarok that made size irrelevant in the same way that a very sharp knife made size irrelevant. He was old, past 200 by goblin reckoning, with the deep graven face of someone who had survived more political catastrophes than most wizards could name, and his eyes were the amber of old whiskey, bright and absolutely still in the way of things that don't need to signal their attention to anyone. He read the report. He set it down. He looked at the far wall for a moment, at a particular section of the filing cases, and then he stood up from behind his desk, moving with the fluid economy of a creature who had never wasted a movement in his life, and went to those cases. The drawer he opened was labeled, in gobbledygook, with a phrase that translated approximately to Potter, pending. It was the thickest drawer in the room. He carried the contents back to his desk and laid them out in sequence. The Potter family account history going back 4 generations. The sealed vault documents for both Potter Primary Trust and the Black Family Inheritance Codicil, the latter of which redirected to Harry Potter upon the deaths of all named primary beneficiaries, a clause that had activated on November 1, 1981, and had been sitting in pending status ever since because the Ministry of Magic had never formally established the child's legal guardianship under magical law, which meant the accounts remained sealed under Goblin Treaty law, which meant they had been accruing interest for 5 years at the rate specified in the Accord of 1289. The Accord of 1289 was a document that most wizards had forgotten existed. This was, from Ragnarok's perspective, their most significant strategic error. The Accord stipulated that Gringotts would manage wizarding wealth in perpetuity, subject to a set of conditions. Those conditions included the protection and legal recognition of all account holders, including minors, under wizarding law. In cases where a minor account holder was placed under guardianship, that guardianship had to be formally registered with Gringotts within 30 days of placement, and the registered guardians were required to certify annually that the minor was being maintained in reasonable health and safety. No guardianship registration had ever been filed for Harry Potter. No annual certification had ever been submitted. The Potter accounts had been sitting sealed for 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days, accruing interest at rates that the Accord specified for accounts in breach of registration requirements, and those rates were, Ragnarok had always found this particular clause satisfying, punitive. He opened his calculation ledger and began writing. He was still writing at 2 a.m. By the time he set the pen down, he had 3 pages of figures, and the total at the bottom of the 3rd page was a number large enough that he allowed himself a single, small, entirely genuine smile. Then he picked up the communication stone on the corner of his desk and summoned his chief legal strategist. Her name was Sharpclaw, and she arrived in Ragnarok's office at 2:19 a.m. looking entirely awake and unsurprised, which was one of the reasons she held the position she did. She was younger than Ragnarok by a century, sharp-featured, with the particular intensity of goblins who had chosen legal combat over physical combat and found it more satisfying on every level. She read the report. She read the Accord calculations. She sat down across from Ragnarok's desk without being invited, because she was one of approximately 4 people in the world who did that without it being a problem, and she said, "The timing is significant." "Yes," Ragnarok said. "The report will be public by morning. The ministry will be in crisis management. Dumbledore's position will be weakened." She looked at the calculation ledger. "If we move while they're already off balance, we move when we're ready," Ragnarok said. "Not before. I want the formal claim drafted by end of day tomorrow, the Accord breach documentation compiled by the day after, and the ultimatum notice ready to send to the Minister of Magic by the end of the week." Sharpclaw nodded, making notes in the rapid, angular shorthand of gobbledygook legal script. "Do we pursue the full Accord remedy?" "We pursue everything we are entitled to," Ragnarok said. "Every clause. Every compounded interest calculation. Every breach notification fee. Every administrative penalty for failure to register." He looked at the report on his desk, at Miriam Voss's careful, precise documentation of what had been done to a child. They had 5 years to file the paperwork. They chose not to. "The ministry will claim Dumbledore acted in loco parentis through informal authority," Sharpclaw said. "They'll try to retroactively legitimize the guardianship." "They are welcome to try," Ragnarok said. "Retroactive legitimization isn't recognized under the Accord. It was specifically excluded in the 1447 amendment following the Greengrass affair, and I will be happy to cite chapter and verse." Sharpclaw smiled, which on a goblin was a sharper expression than on most species. "And the boy himself?" He's 6. He'll be 7 in July, Ragnock said. By the time this reaches formal proceedings, he'll be of age to ratify his own account registration under emergency minor provisions. I'd like to meet him. His healer controls access. Then I'd like to meet his healer. Ragnock stood, which on a goblin was a signal that a meeting was concluded. Get me a copy of Healer Voss's professional record. I want to know who we're dealing with before I walk into that ward. Sharpclaw stood. She picked up her notes, tucking them into the flat case she carried. At the door she paused. Ragnock, she said. If this goes to full accord enforcement, it will. The ministry will call it an invasion. Ragnock looked at her. Those amber eyes, perfectly still, perfectly patient. The ministry, he said, may call it whatever they like. What it is a legal claim. And I have documentation going back 537 years. He picked up his pen again. Close the door on your way out. The Daily Prophet headline hit the wizarding world at the same time as it hit the Dursleys' doorstep, and the reaction was not what anyone in the ministry's crisis management office had predicted. They had predicted grief. The wizarding world had been told for 5 years that Harry Potter was being quietly and safely cared for, living a normal life, protected by powerful blood wards, and the revelation that this was not entirely true was expected to produce the grief of betrayal. Instead it produced rage. The distinction was important. Grief made people want comfort. Rage made people want answers, and then action, and the wizarding world, which had collectively stood in the street outside Harry Potter's parents' house and wept for 3 days when he was orphaned, which had celebrated his survival with such intensity that even the most stone-faced among them had raised a glass, did not manage their rage quietly. By noon on the day of the headline, the ministry's public correspondence office had received 1,847 letters. By 3 o'clock it was over 4,000. The Flu Network's public lines were jammed for 6 hours. 3 members of the Wisengamot issued public statements demanding an emergency session. The Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, who had been in office for 2 years and was still largely running on political goodwill and an impressive hat collection, held a press conference at 2 p.m. and said a great number of carefully managed words that added up to absolutely nothing, and the Prophet ran the transcript under the headline Fudge responds, Minister says ongoing investigation, 7 times in 15 minutes. Amelia Bones watched the press conference from her office with the television static expression of someone who had made peace with their institutional situation and was quietly planning to work around it. She had 2 Aurors stationed outside the Dursleys' cell in the ministry's holding facility, where Vernon and Petunia had been since noon. She had Miriam Voss's supplementary report on her desk, the one that included the Dumbledore consultation with its recording lamp timestamp. She had a summons for Dumbledore scheduled for the following morning. And she had, as of 3:47 p.m., a formal communication from Gringotts Bank delivered by a goblin courier who had walked through the ministry's main entrance, past security, past the reception desk, and directly into her office without being stopped, because the courier had presented a document at each checkpoint that identified her as a legal representative of the Goblin Nation acting under the Accord of 1289, and nobody at those checkpoints had been willing to admit they didn't know what that meant. The communication was 3 pages. Amelia read it twice, and then she read the accompanying schedule of Accord breach calculations, and then she sat back in her chair and thought about the number at the bottom of the 3rd page for a long moment. She picked up her communications mirror and called Arthur Weasley's extension in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, because Arthur Weasley was one of the few people in the ministry she trusted implicitly and also one of the few who had met Ragnock before. Arthur, she said when he appeared in the mirror, slightly breathless from rushing across his office. The Accord of 1289. What do you know about it? Arthur's expression did something complicated. The Goblin Accord? Good Lord, Amelia, where did that come from? Gringotts delivered a formal notice this afternoon. Full Accord enforcement. I need someone who knows the history. Arthur sat down. He pulled off his glasses and rubbed his face. Right. Right, okay. The Accord of 1289 was the original agreement between the British ministry's predecessor, the Magical Council of the time, and the Goblin nation, establishing Gringotts as the exclusive magical banking institution. The Goblins agreed to manage wizarding wealth indefinitely. In exchange, the ministry agreed to a set of conditions governing how they treated Goblin interests, including the legal recognition and protection of all account holders. Including minors, Amelia said. Including, Arthur stopped. He put his glasses back on. Oh, he said, quietly. Oh, Harry. If the ministry failed to register Harry's guardianship and certify his well-being annually, Amelia said, we are in accord breach. And the breach penalties are compounded, Arthur said. I know. My father used to say the Accord was the most dangerous document in wizarding history because nobody read it and the Goblins never forgot a word of it. He paused. What's the figure, Amelia? She told him. The silence on the other end of the mirror was the silence of a man doing very rapid mental arithmetic and arriving at a very large number. That's, Arthur said. That would destabilize the ministry's financial reserves for approximately 15 years, Amelia said. Yes. I did the same arithmetic. What does Ragnarok want? Payment, obviously. But also formal legal recognition of the Accord's remaining provisions, most of which the ministry has been quietly ignoring since 1899. Goblin ownership rights for created magical artifacts. Goblin representation on the Wisengamot's Financial Oversight Panel. Recognition of Harry Potter's account status and formal establishment of legal guardianship under terms that Gringotts, not the ministry, not Dumbledore, must certify and approve. She paused. And a meeting. Ragnarok wants to come to St Mungo's. To see Harry. To see Harry. Arthur was quiet for a moment. What does Voss say? I haven't asked her yet. But Ragnarok specifically said he'd wait for her approval. Amelia straightened the papers on her desk. Which tells me he's done his research on her, and he wants her on his side, and he's smart enough to approach it correctly. He's always been smart enough, Arthur said. That's what makes this terrifying. He's not being impulsive. This has been planned. Of course it has, Amelia said. He's been waiting for the right moment for 20 years. And we handed it to him. Miriam Voss spent the day removing charms. It was painstaking work, the kind that required the same concentration as diffusing something that might or might not explode, because Harry's magic was not passive under the counter-curse work. It was responsive. Every time she removed a layer, the space it left filled almost immediately with something that hadn't been there before, a slight increase in the ambient magical temperature, a subtle pressure against her healer's shields, a quality to the air in the room that reminded her of standing in open countryside just before a thunderstorm. By 10 a.m. she'd removed 8 more. By 2 p.m., 12. She paced it carefully, watching his vitals after each removal, making sure his body, which was getting proper food for the first time in its remembered history, was keeping up with the changes in his magical output. Harry, for his part, was the most remarkable patient she had ever treated. He didn't complain. He didn't fidget. He answered her questions with the precise, economical accuracy of someone who had learned that detailed communication was more efficient than vague distress, and when the counter-curse work made his magic surge and the room's lights went momentarily supernova bright, he just blinked and said, sorry, as though he'd hiccuped at the dinner table. Don't apologize for that, Miriam said, for the 3rd time. Old habit, he said, which landed in the room with more weight than he probably intended. Between sessions she brought him books. The hospital ward had a small library, mostly aimed at adult patients, but she'd raided the children's section of a Muggle bookshop that morning and come back with a bag that Harry excavated with the focused delight of someone who had been given a very large meal after a very long fast. He read quickly and with total absorption, and when he finished one he set it aside and picked up the next without any fuss, and Miriam observed this and added it to the file she was building in her head about who Harry Potter was, separate from the medical record of what had been done to him. At 4 p.m. she got Amelia's message about Ragnarok. She read it standing in the corridor outside Harry's room. Then she went in and sat down in the chair beside his bed, where he was 3/4 through a Muggle adventure novel about a boy who sailed to a mysterious island. "Harry," she said. "How do you feel about meeting someone new?" He looked up from the book with the particular look of someone pulled out of a vivid elsewhere. "Who?" "His name is Ragnarok. He's a goblin. Specifically, he's the king of the British Goblin nation, and he runs Gringotts Bank, which is where your family's money is kept." She paused. "He'd like to meet you. I won't bring him in unless you say yes." Harry considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. "Why does he want to meet me?" "Partly because of your accounts at Gringotts. Partly, I think, because he's read my report and he wants to see for himself." She met his eyes. "You don't have to. And if you say yes now and change your mind before he arrives, that's also fine." "Is he safe?" Harry asked. "I believe so. He's coming here as a legal representative, not as," she paused, finding the right words. "He's not coming to frighten you or pressure you. He has business reasons for wanting to meet you, and I think he'll be honest about what they are." Harry thought about it. "I've never met a goblin." "They're different from how they're sometimes described," Miriam said. "Pay attention to what he does, not just what he looks like." "Like with people," Harry said. "Exactly like with people." He looked back at his book for a moment, and then set it down with the bookmark in place. "Okay," he said. "He can come." Ragnarok arrived the following morning. He came without a retinue, which Miriam had not expected, and without announcement, which she had. He was smaller than she'd imagined from Amelia's description. Goblins were always smaller in person than in imagination, and he wore plain, dark clothes and carried nothing, no case or scroll or visible documentation of any kind. He presented himself at the ward's reception desk, gave his name, and waited to be collected. Miriam met him in the corridor and they looked at each other for a moment with the mutual assessment of two people who had both read everything available about the other person in the preceding 24 hours. "Healer Voss," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, and his English was entirely without accent, which somehow made it more formal rather than less. "King Ragnarok," she said. "Thank you for agreeing to my conditions. You asked for honesty, a time limit of 30 minutes, and no discussion of financial matters until Harry has eaten breakfast," Ragnarok said. "Those are reasonable conditions. Shall we?" She took him in. Harry was eating toast, 4 pieces, which he was getting through steadily and without any of the apologetic haste he'd shown on the first day, which Miriam noted as progress. He looked up when they came in, and he looked at Ragnarok with the same direct, assessing attention he gave everything, and there was a moment, a brief, strange moment, where the two of them, the ancient Goblin King and the 6-year-old boy, looked at each other with what Miriam could only describe as mutual recognition. As though they had, in some indefinable way, been expecting each other. "Good morning," Ragnarok said, and he pulled up a chair without being invited and sat down at Harry's eye level rather than standing over him, which told Miriam that he'd thought carefully about how to approach this. "Morning," Harry said. He looked at Ragnarok's face, the ancient, carved features, the amber eyes, with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. "You're old." "I am," Ragnarok agreed, without any offense. "And you run the bank." "I do." "The one that has my parents' money?" "Yes." "Which has been waiting for you, with interest, since your parents died." Ragnarok folded his hands on his knee. "I wanted to meet you because your situation concerns me on several levels, and I think you deserve to hear why before anyone else explains it to you." Harry ate a piece of toast. He was listening. Miriam had learned that Harry's eating and listening were not mutually exclusive, that he had in fact probably learned to process information while eating because eating was never guaranteed to last long enough to give it its own separate time. "My people," Ragnarok said, "have an agreement with the wizarding government. A very old one. Part of that agreement says that when a wizarding child with accounts at Gringotts is placed under guardianship, that guardianship must be registered with us, and we must be told every year that the child is safe." He paused. "Nobody told us you existed. Nobody registered anything. And so your accounts have been sitting sealed, and the people who were supposed to look after you never had to answer to us for how they were doing it." Harry's hands had gone still on the toast. He was very focused now. "I'm going to fix that," Ragnock said. "I'm going to make the ministry acknowledge what the agreement says. And I'm going to make sure that whoever takes care of you from now on is someone we can hold accountable. Not just the ministry. Us. Goblins have longer memories than wizards, and we don't forget contracts." "Why?" Harry said. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. Ragnock was quiet for a moment. Something moved in those amber eyes that Miriam hadn't expected, something very old and, she thought, very tired. "Because," he said, "I have been making agreements with wizards for 500 years, and they have been breaking those agreements for 500 years, and always the people who suffer are the ones who had the least power to object. Your parents had accounts in my bank. They trusted my institution with their wealth and their history. My institution failed you." He met Harry's eyes directly. "I take that seriously." Harry looked at him for a long time. "Are you going to fix it because it's the right thing or because it helps you?" Ragnock's mouth curved, not a smile exactly, but a very old kind of acknowledgement. "Both," he said. "And I am telling you that clearly because I think you are someone who would rather have the truth than a comfortable version of it." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his toast and took another bite, and Miriam, watching, had the distinct impression that the decision had been made somewhere in the last 90 seconds, clean and without drama, the way Harry seemed to make all his decisions. "What do you need me to do?" Harry asked. At the moment, Ragnock said, "Nothing. Eat your breakfast. Let Healer Voss finish her work. I'll deal with the ministry. And after? After, when you're well enough, I'd like to formally register your account access and arrange for you to visit the bank. But that can wait." He stood, straightening his jacket. "I have documents to file and a minister for magic to terrify. I'll leave you to your toast." He turned toward the door, and Harry said, "Ragnock." The Goblin King turned. "Thank you for coming yourself," Harry said. "And for explaining it." Ragnock looked at him for a moment. "You are very like your father," he said. "He also always wanted to know the real reason for things." And then he left, with the quiet, efficient movement of someone who had places to be and had already decided exactly how each of them would go. The formal claim arrived at the Minister for Magic's office at 3 p.m. that afternoon, delivered by 6 Goblin legal representatives who arrived simultaneously at 6 different ministry entrances, each carrying a certified copy. The synchronization was deliberate. So was the number. So was the fact that every copy was delivered to a different senior ministry official, the minister, the head of the DMLE, the head of the Department of Magical Law, the head of International Magical Cooperation, the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and 1 copy to Albus Dumbledore personally, delivered to the gargoyle entrance of the headmaster's office at Hogwarts by a goblin courier who had apparat to the Hogwarts boundary and walked, unhurried, up the drive. The claim ran to 47 pages. The accompanying accord breach calculations ran to 12. The schedule of remedies demanded ran to 8. The covering letter was 3 paragraphs and was written in language so precise and legally complete that the ministry's own legal department spent 4 hours trying to find a procedural error and came back with nothing. Fudge called an emergency cabinet meeting. It lasted 3 hours and produced a statement that described the claim as a matter of significant complexity requiring careful consideration, which the prophet ran alongside a quote from an unnamed ministry source who described the mood inside the meeting as, like someone set off a dung bomb in a library and everyone was pretending they couldn't smell it. The Wizengamot's emergency session was called for the end of the week. Dumbledore, who had received his copy of the claim at 3:47 p.m. and had read it in his office while Fawkes made the low, concerned sound phoenixes made when their companions were troubled, sent 3 letters that evening. One to the minister. One to Amelia Bones. One to a person whose name Miriam Voss didn't know yet but would learn shortly. In St Mungo's, Harry ate dinner, read 2 more chapters of his island adventure book, asked Miriam 3 questions about Goblin history that she answered as best she could, and went to sleep at 9 o'clock. He had 31 charms to go. When the last one came off, whatever had been building in that vast, constrained core was going to have all the room it had always been owed. Miriam Voss was not the only one making preparations for that. In his office 6 levels below the lobby of Gringotts, Ragnar sat at his clear desk and reviewed the day's work with the satisfaction of someone who had been moving pieces toward this configuration for a very long time. He had the claim filed. He had the Accord documentation in the hands of every person who needed to be holding it. He had met Harry Potter, which had been, in its way, the most important item on the day's agenda. He had expected to find a child. He had found something rather different, something small and underfed and visibly rebuilding itself piece by piece, but also something that looked at the world with a clarity that 5 years of deliberate suppression had not touched. The magic was there, enormous, even half-caged, like trying to hold a river in a paper bag, and underneath the magic was a mind that asked the right questions and filed the real answers. They had tried to make him small. They had tried for 6 years, with extraordinary dedication and considerable professional skill, to make him less than he was. It hadn't worked. Ragnar picked up his pen and began writing the next stage of the strategy. On the desk beside his elbow, in a slim folder, was a document he hadn't filed yet. He would need Harry's signature on it, Harry's and his designated guardians, whoever that turned out to be, but the groundwork was there. An emergency trust access clause. An account registration under the Accord's minority protection provisions. And, nested inside the legal language with the care that Sharpclaw had given to every word, a clause that established Gringotts itself as secondary legal guardian of record, not primary, not intrusive, but present, a formal, binding, 500-year-old institution that would notice if anyone ever tried to do to Harry Potter what had already been done to him. Ragnar was not given to sentiment. He was, however, given to thoroughness. He signed the document where his signature was required and set it aside to dry. Outside, London was getting dark. Somewhere above him, 6 levels up, people were walking past the bronze doors of Gringotts and thinking about money, as they always did. They were not thinking about the Accord. They were not thinking about what it meant to have an agreement and then slowly, consistently, conveniently forget every clause that cost them something. They would be thinking about it soon. Ragnar blew out the lamp on his desk and sat in the comfortable dark of his office, listening to the deep, stone-silent heartbeat of the oldest building in Wizarding Britain. He had waited 20 years for the right moment. He was a patient creature. But he was done waiting. Chapter 3, The Boy Himself. 26 charms left when Harry woke up on the 4th morning and the window of his ward room was doing something it shouldn't. Not broken, nothing so simple. The glass itself was fine. But the light coming through it was bending, pooling in the corners of the room in small, warm concentrations, gathering like water in low places, and in one corner a shaft of morning sun had folded itself into a rough sphere about the size of a fist and was rotating slowly, 2 feet off the floor, for no apparent reason. Harry was watching it when Miriam came in at 7 with his breakfast tray. She stopped in the doorway. Looked at the rotating sphere of light. Looked at Harry. "Did you do that?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I woke up and it was there. But I think," he frowned, the particular frown of someone trying to describe a sensation they have no vocabulary for. "I think I did it while I was sleeping. It felt like something I was doing." Miriam set the tray down and took out her diagnostic scope, a small silver instrument, like a compass without cardinal directions, and held it up. The needle spun wildly for a second and then settled, pointing at Harry with the conviction of a thing that had found north. "Your output increased overnight," she said. "Significantly." She lowered the scope. "How do you feel?" "Less heavy," Harry said. He picked up a piece of toast, looked at the light sphere, and then looked back at her. "Is that bad?" No, Miriam said, pulling up her chair. It's your magic finding its shape. 26 charms are still a lot, but we've taken off 45, and what's left underneath is, she paused, searching for the accurate word. Stretching. Like a muscle that's been held in one position for too long. It's uncomfortable at first. It's not uncomfortable, Harry said. It's loud. Miriam considered that. Loud how? Harry thought about it seriously, the way he did with every question that deserved a real answer. Like, before, it was very quiet. Inside, I mean. There was just this flat quiet, and things were heavy, and I was always hungry. And now it's like, he looked at the sphere of light again. Like standing next to a waterfall. Except the waterfall is inside. Miriam wrote that down. She wrote down everything Harry said about his own magic, because Harry's descriptions were more clinically useful than half the diagnostic instruments in the hospital. He felt his own core with a precision that suggested either extraordinary natural sensitivity or a life spent in such constant connection with a constrained thing that he'd learned every note of it. Probably both. Eat, she said. We'll do another removal session at 9. I want to get through at least 10 today. Harry ate. The light sphere continued rotating in the corner. By the time Miriam finished the 9 o'clock session, the number was at 16 remaining, and the sphere of light had been joined by 2 more, one near the ceiling, one hovering about an inch above Harry's bedside table, and the ambient temperature in the room had climbed to something subtropical. The Medowitch who brought Harry's mid-morning snack opened the door, walked into what felt like a midsummer afternoon, looked at the 3 spheres of rotating light, and went to find Miriam with the expression of someone who needed a more senior opinion. The senior opinion was, "This is extraordinary and also fine, please bring another blanket even though it's warm, he finds them comforting." What Miriam did not say to the Medowitch, because it would have required explaining things that were above a Medowitch's scope and also slightly above her own, was that the light spheres were not accidental magic. She'd been watching them for 2 hours. They were too consistent. Too deliberate in their rotation, in the way they distributed themselves around Harry's space. They weren't random discharges of a loosening core, they were constructions, small and unconscious, but constructions nonetheless. Harry was building things in his sleep and between thoughts, the way a musician's fingers move through scales when their mind is elsewhere. A 6-year-old was performing continuous ambient magical construction without conscious effort. She made a note of it and moved on, because the clinical alternative, stopping to fully process how remarkable this was not something she could afford right now. She had 16 charms left, a Wisengamot session at the end of the week, a visitor scheduled for 2 o'clock, and a documentation report due to Amelia Bones by 5. She would be extraordinary about it later. The 2 o'clock visitor was one she'd requested herself. His name was Septimus Okafor, and he was the head of St Mungo's Unusual Magical Phenomena Research Unit, which was the department that handled cases that the standard diagnostic manuals didn't have categories for. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the calm of someone who had spent 40 years being professionally surprised by magic and had made peace with the fact that magic was always going to be more creative than any framework built to describe it. He was also, Miriam knew, one of the few people in British wizarding medicine who had ever dealt with a naturally occurring unbound magical core, cases where a core's natural suppressors hadn't developed correctly, which was rare but documented. This wasn't that. But it was the closest analog she had. She met him in the corridor before she brought him in. "What am I walking into?" he said, which was how he opened every consultation. 6-year-old, 45 charms removed over 4 days, 16 remaining, Miriam said. Core size is off my diagnostic scale, literally, the instrument tops out and he keeps going. Ambient magical output is continuous and, I believe, semi-conscious. He's been building light constructs since this morning without any apparent effort. He describes his magic as a waterfall. She paused. He's also extremely perceptive, he'll know if you're surprised, and I'd recommend just letting him see it. Okafor raised an eyebrow. Let him see my surprise? He responds better to honesty than to managed reactions. She met his eyes. He's been managing other people's reactions his entire life. He's tired of it. Okafor nodded, tucked his hands in his coat pockets, and followed her in. Harry looked up from his book when they entered, a different book now, a fat one about the history of mathematics that Miriam had raised an eyebrow at, and he'd looked back at her with a perfectly neutral expression until she put it on the pile, and he looked at Okafor with the usual direct assessment. "This is Healer Okafor," Miriam said. "He specializes in unusual magic." "And mine is unusual," Harry said. "Very," Okafor said. He looked at the 3 light spheres, then at his own diagnostic instruments, and then, as promised, let Harry see exactly how surprised he was, which was considerably. "May I?" He gestured at the sphere nearest the bed. "I don't know how to turn them off," Harry said, sounding only slightly apologetic. "I don't want you to." Okafor reached out and passed his hand through the sphere, which held its shape under the contact, parting around his hand like smoke and then reforming. He made a small sound of pure professional delight. "Remarkable. These are fully formed constructs. You know how many years of deliberate study it takes a trained witch or wizard to build a sustained light construct?" "How many?" Harry asked. "Roughly 5. Newt-level charms work, minimum. Most adults can't sustain one for more than 20 minutes. Okafor lowered his hand. "You have 3 running simultaneously. Since this morning." Harry looked at the spheres. "I didn't know I was doing it." "That's the interesting part," Okafor said. He pulled up a chair without ceremony and sat down, opening his diagnostic case on his knee. "May I run some tests?" "Nothing that involves removing or adding anything, just observing." "Okay," Harry said. Okafor ran his tests for 40 minutes. Harry submitted to them with patient cooperation, answering questions about what he felt when Okafor activated different diagnostic frequencies, which was, Miriam observed, watching from the foot of the bed, actually quite a lot. Harry felt all of it. He described each sensation with careful accuracy, and the picture that emerged from his descriptions, laid alongside Okafor's readings, was something that neither of them had documentation for and would be writing up for the Journal of Magical Medicine for the better part of the next year. At the end of the 40 minutes, Okafor closed his case, looked at Harry with undisguised fascination, and said, "Harry, I have one more question and I'd like you to answer it without trying to give me the answer you think I'm looking for." "Okay," Harry said. "When you do magic, not the ambient stuff, the spheres, but when you actually intend to do something, what happens?" Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hand, open on the blanket. Then he looked at his glass of water on the bedside table, about 18 inches away. The glass moved. Not a fumbling, accidental magic scoot across the surface, it glided, smooth and deliberate, crossing the 18 inches and settling into Harry's hand without a sound, without a tremor, without disturbing the book beside it or the tray it had been sitting on. Then he handed the glass to Okafor with a look that said like that. Okafor took the glass. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at Harry. "Wandless," he said. "I don't know what a wand does," Harry said, which was perhaps the most accurate description of wandless magic Miriam had ever encountered. "A wand," Okafor said carefully, "focuses and channels magical intention. Most wizards need one because without it their magic is," he paused, "imprecise. Unfocused. Accidental. What you just did, with that precision, that control, at this age, without any training at all," he looked at Miriam. She looked back at him. They were having a rapid, silent conversation conducted entirely in expressions. "You can say it out loud," Harry said. "I'm right here." Okafor turned back to him. He put the glass down on the table. "What you just did," he said, "is something most trained adult wizards cannot do. The precision alone," he shook his head. "With the remaining charms removed and your core fully accessible, I genuinely don't know what you'll be capable of. I don't think anyone does." Harry considered this for a moment. Then, is that a problem? For you? No, Okafor said. For the people who are going to have to figure out what to do with you. He almost smiled. Possibly. They'll figure it out, Harry said, and picked up his mathematics book. Miriam took the last 16 charms off on the morning of day 5. She had prepped the room the way you prepped a room for a delicate magical procedure: shields on the walls, a dampening field across the door and windows, a calming charm on the monitoring instruments because she didn't want them going haywire and alarming the rest of the ward. She had Okafor on standby in the corridor. She had a Medowitch outside with a specific list of things to have ready. Then she sat down beside Harry, explained each step of what she was going to do, listened to his questions, answered them, and began. The first 10 came off cleanly. By the 6th Harry's eyes had closed, not in pain but in the concentrated absorption of someone feeling something very precisely. By the 10th the temperature in the room had climbed again, and all 3 light spheres had expanded to roughly the size of footballs, and there were 2 more that hadn't been there before. She paused. "How are you doing?" "Keep going," he said, without opening his eyes. The 11th. The 12th. On the 13th the dampening field across the window cracked down the middle, not violently but cleanly, like a sheet of ice splitting along a fault line. Miriam reinforced it, redirected, kept working. 14. 15. She took a breath. "Last one, Harry." "I know," he said. His voice was very calm. "I can feel it." She cast the final counter-curse. What happened next was not dramatic, in the way that genuinely significant things are often not dramatic: no explosion, no visible shockwave, no lightning or thunder or anything so obvious. What happened was a sound, too low to be a sound exactly, more like the room decided to inhale. The dampening field dissolved entirely, simply ceasing to exist. The 5 light spheres, now the size of beach balls, stopped rotating and hung perfectly still for exactly 2 seconds. Then they all went out. The room was briefly, completely dark, though it was 9 in the morning and the sun was full outside. Then the light came back, not from the spheres, not from the window, but from Harry himself, a brief, vivid, golden pulse that lasted perhaps half a second before it settled, sank back into him, and the room returned to ordinary daylight. The monitoring instruments, which had all gone dark with the spheres, flickered back on. The temperature in the room normalized instantly, dropping 20 degrees in the space of a breath without being cold. And Harry Potter opened his eyes. Miriam had been watching his face throughout. She had seen children after procedures, after surgeries, after magical treatments of all kinds, the particular expressions people wore when something painful was finally over. She knew what relief looked like, and she knew what shock looked like, and she knew what the strange blankness of a person encountering a new version of themselves for the first time looked like. Harry's face, when he opened his eyes, was none of those things. He looked like someone who had just stepped out of a very small, very dark room into open air. Calm. Present. Breathing carefully, the way you breathed when you were testing a new thing. His eyes were so vivid they almost looked lit from within, which she suspected was not entirely optical illusion. He looked around the room. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. "It's quiet," he said. "The spheres went out," she said. "Not them." He turned his hand over, looking at his palm. "Before, the waterfall," I said. Loud. "But now it's," he paused for the right word. "Even. Like it stopped fighting the container because there's no container anymore." Miriam felt something in her chest that she was not going to examine in a clinical context. She made a note instead. "How's the hunger?" she asked. Harry looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him, and it was, in its small, contained way, incandescent. "Gone," he said. She gave him the morning to simply be. No tests, no visitors, no documentation sessions. She brought lunch and ate with him, which she had been doing every day, and they talked about the mathematics book. He'd finished it, and had thoughts about Fibonacci sequences that she couldn't entirely follow, and about the view from the window, which was London's grey and gold midday, and about nothing in particular. It was the nothing in particular that told her the most. In his first days at the hospital, Harry had never done nothing in particular. He had always been working, reading, thinking, processing, filing information. Even his rest had had the quality of active preparation. But this morning, after the last charm, he sat in the window and watched the city and ate his lunch and talked about things that had no strategic value whatsoever, and it was such a simple, childlike thing that Miriam had to go to the medication cabinet in the corridor for 60 seconds and stand with her forehead against the cool door. 6 years, she thought. 6 years of that constant engine running on low fuel, and he'd never just sat. She went back in when she was sure her face was healer appropriate. "Miriam," Harry said, without looking up from the window. "Yes. Is there going to be a trial?" He said it the way he said most difficult things, not bracing for it, just asking. "Yes. The Wisengamot is having an emergency session at the end of this week. The Dursleys will be formally charged." She came and sat in the chair. "You may be asked to speak at it. Nobody will force you to." "I want to," Harry said. "You want to go to the Wisengamot?" "I want to say what happened." He turned from the window then, and looked at her with those clear, direct eyes. "Not because I'm angry. I'm not," he frowned slightly, examining his own interior. "I'm not angry. But that's not why I want to say it. I want to say it because the people who are going to decide things should know exactly what actually happened, not just what's in reports." Miriam looked at him for a moment. "You don't trust the reports to be enough?" "Reports are written by people who are already deciding what's important," Harry said. "Not cynically, just accurately. I should be there to say the parts they might not put in." She thought about Dumbledore saying "I'm aware" to the recording lamp. She thought about Fudge saying "ongoing investigation" 7 times. "You're right," she said. "Will you be there?" "Wild horses," Miriam said, "and an army of healers couldn't keep me out." Harry's mouth did the almost smile again. He turned back to the window. "Ragnarok will be there too," he said. I think he'd already planned to be. He had, Miriam confirmed. Good. Harry watched a cloud cross the London sky. People pay more attention when everyone who knows something is in the room. Amelia Bones came that afternoon, not in any official capacity but because she had read Miriam's morning report and she wanted to see for herself. She came in plain robes, without her aura, and she sat across from Harry with the careful directness she always used, which Harry responded to the way he responded to all direct communication, with immediate, uncomplicated engagement. "How do you feel?" she asked him, which Miriam noted was the same first question she asked everyone, and which was both a genuine inquiry and a diagnostic tool. "Better," Harry said. "Different. Like I've been living in a coat that was 3 sizes too small and someone finally took it off." He paused. "Healer Voss finished this morning." "I know. I read her report." Amelia folded her hands. "Harry, I want to tell you what's going to happen this week, and I want to tell you all of it, including the parts that aren't straightforward. Is that all right?" "Yes," he said. "The Wisengamot, that's our legal court, our parliament, they handle both, is convening an emergency session on Friday. The Dursleys will appear before it and formal charges will be presented." She paused. "Dumbledore will also be asked to testify." Harry's face didn't change. "About what he did," he said. "About his role in your placement and," Amelia chose her words carefully, and Miriam recognized the precision of someone who was walking a line between official caution and personal conviction. "And about the charms. There is evidence suggesting that the original application was not performed by the Dursleys themselves, given the professional construction Healer Voss documented. The question of who performed it, and under whose instruction, is part of the investigation." He said he was aware, Harry said. To Miriam. When she met with him. Amelia looked at Miriam. Miriam nodded. The recording lamp. I know, Amelia said. That record will be presented to the Wiesengemot. She turned back to Harry. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it rather than answer immediately. Would you be willing to testify? Yes, Harry said immediately. Amelia's mouth twitched. I asked you to think about it. I did think about it, Harry said. This morning, before you came. Miriam said the same thing. He looked at Amelia steadily. I want to be there. I want the people making decisions to hear it from me. Amelia was quiet for a moment. She had the look of someone recalibrating, not her position, but her expectations. Miriam had been doing that regularly since day one. All right, Amelia said. Then I'll prepare you for what testifying involves. It's not like a normal conversation. There are procedures, forms of address, and there will be members of the Wiesengemot who will ask you questions that feel hostile. Not because they're bad people necessarily, but because that's how the adversarial process works. They'll try to make me seem less reliable, Harry said. Some of them, yes. Because if my testimony is reliable, some of them are in trouble, Harry said. Amelia looked at him. Then she looked at Miriam, who gave her a small, eloquent shrug that said I know. That's a fairly sophisticated understanding of legal proceedings for someone your age, Amelia said. Is it wrong? Harry asked. No, Amelia said. It's exactly right. Harry nodded, satisfied. Then I'll learn the procedures. And the forms of address. He reached for his book, not the mathematics one, which he'd finished, but a different one Miriam had brought, about magical British history. Can you leave me a list of the things I need to know? I'll send a document tonight, Amelia said. She stood. Healer Voss will review it with you. She paused at the door. Harry. For what it's worth, and I know it's limited worth coming from someone who's part of the system that failed you, I'm sorry this happened. Harry looked at her with those remarkable eyes. He thought about it, genuinely thought, she could see him doing it. You're sorry because it shouldn't have happened, he said, not because you feel responsible for the part where it did. Yes, Amelia said. That's right. Then the apology is fine, Harry said. I don't need people to feel guilty. I need them to fix it. Amelia left. The door closed. Miriam sat in her chair and looked at the 6-year-old with his history book, who had just made one of the most precise moral distinctions she'd ever heard from an adult, let alone a child. You're going to be extraordinary, she said, before she could think about whether to say it. Harry looked up from his book. I'm already extraordinary, he said, without any arrogance at all, just the calm assessment of someone stating a fact that they'd had confirmed several times and had now simply filed accordingly. I need to learn how to be useful. He went back to his book. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the room in long bars of gold, and nowhere in the room did a single sphere of light rotate, because Harry's magic was finally still, finally settled, finally occupying its proper space, enormous and even and entirely, undeniably his. Ragnarok came back the following morning. This time he brought Sharpclaw, and Sharpclaw brought documents, not the intimidating legal stacks she carried to ministry meetings but 2 slim folders, neat and specific. Harry was eating breakfast when they came in. He looked up, registered both of them, and moved his book to make room on the bedside table without being asked. Good morning, Ragnarok said, sitting down. Morning, Harry said. You look like something went well. Ragnarok's expression shifted in the way that was as close as he came to pleased. Several things, he said. We filed the formal claim yesterday afternoon. The ministry is, he paused, selecting the appropriate word. Panicking, Sharpclaw said, without looking up from her folders. Responding, Ragnarok said. Which is a start. He looked at Harry. I need to go over something with you and Healer Voss, if you're both willing. The account registration and the guardianship clause. It's paperwork, but it's important. Miriam, who had been leaning against the wall by the door, came forward and took the second chair. Sharpclaw produced 2 documents from the first folder and laid them on the flat part of the bedside table that Harry had cleared. She didn't explain them immediately, which Miriam found interesting. She waited, and Harry looked at them, and then looked at her. "Can I read them?" Harry asked. "I was going to suggest it," Sharpclaw said. Harry read. He read the way he did everything, completely, without rushing, turning each page over when he was done with it and going back twice to the sections that had the most dense legal language. It took him 20 minutes, which was, Miriam noted, roughly the same time it had taken Amelia Bones to read the claim. "The secondary guardian clause," Harry said, when he finished. He looked at Ragnarok. "Gringotts as secondary guardian. A formal record," Ragnarok said. "Binding under the accord. If any future guardian fails in their duty, we are legally empowered to intervene and challenge them." "Have you ever used a clause like that before?" Harry asked. "No," Ragnarok said. "Because?" "Because it was never necessary," Ragnarok said. "No child with Gringotts accounts has been placed without proper registration before." Harry looked at the document. "So you'd be creating a new precedent?" "Yes. If it works," Harry said, "it could apply to other wizarding children too. Not just me." Sharpclaw looked up from her folder for the first time, and looked at Ragnarok, and then at Harry. "That," Ragnarok said, "is the intention." Harry looked at the documents for another moment. Then he picked up his quill. Miriam had provided him with standard hospital stationery, which he had been using to take notes on everything he read, and he signed where the signature lines were, clearly and without hesitation, his name in the careful deliberate handwriting of someone who had taught himself from books. He handed the quill to Miriam. She read her section, noted that Sharpclaw had been extremely thorough and the clause protecting her professional oversight was airtight, and signed. Ragnarok signed last. He used his own pen, which was old and made of dark wood, and his signature in gobbledygook was a single, complex character that Miriam thought looked like it had been drawn in one continuous motion. Sharpclaw collected the documents, returned them to the folder, and produced the second folder. "Account access summary," she said, sliding it toward Harry. "Your holdings, compound interest included, current total." Harry opened it. He read the figure at the top. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Miriam. "Is this," he started. "Yes," Miriam said, having already been briefed. He looked back at the figure. His face was doing something complicated, not greed, nothing so simple. More the expression of someone confronting the proof of how much had been kept from them, in the most quantifiable possible form. 5 years of interest alone was more than most wizarding families held in total. "The compound interest accrued during the period of accord breach," Ragnarok said, "is reflected in that figure. It is yours. Entirely. The Potter vaults, the black codicil, all of it." Harry closed the folder. He held it in his hands for a moment, and then set it on the bedside table beside his book. "What happens to people who had access to accounts they shouldn't have had?" he asked, very evenly. Sharpclaw's expression was somewhere between professional neutrality and satisfaction. "They repay them. With interest." "Good," Harry said. He picked up his breakfast spoon again. "Will you stay for tea?" he asked Ragnarok. Ragnarok looked at him. There was something in those amber eyes, something that Miriam thought was, from a creature who had survived 2 centuries of wizarding politics, the closest thing to pure respect. "Yes," the Goblin King said. "I think I will." So they had tea in St Mungo's hospital room on a grey Thursday morning, a 6-year-old with magic like a live wire, an old Goblin King who had been planning this week for 20 years, his chief legal strategist who never stopped taking notes, and a healer who had intended to spend this month doing routine charm reversals and had instead somehow ended up at the center of the most significant magical legal event in a generation. They talked about, of all things, mathematics. Harry had questions about Goblin numerical systems, which were base 12 rather than base 10 and which Sharpclaw could explain with the crisp authority of someone who'd grown up using them. Ragnock listened, drank his tea, and occasionally added a correction that Sharpclaw acknowledged without any wounded pride, because goblins considered accurate correction a form of respect. Harry asked about the accord, not the legal mechanics, which he'd read about, but the history. Why 1289? What the original negotiation had been like. Ragnock answered with the detail of someone speaking from institutional memory, and Harry listened with the same absorption he gave his books. At one point Ragnock said, not particularly addressing anyone, the problem with wizarding law is that it was built by people who expect it to always be the most powerful thing in the room. It has no architecture for accountability. We're working on that, Miriam said. The Wisengamot session is Friday, Harry said. Ragnock will be there too. And then the ministry will have to respond to the claim, and then, he paused, and looked at Ragnock. When you said it might look like an invasion. Will it? Officially, Ragnock said, what happens next week is a legal enforcement action. What the ministry chooses to call it is their problem. Harry's mouth did its almost smile. He looked out the window at the grey London sky. I want to go home, he said, and it came out quiet, not mournful, just honest. Not to the Dursleys. I mean home. Somewhere that's mine. He paused. I've never had that. Nobody said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that was worth saying. Not yet. But Miriam made a note, and Ragnock's pen, she noticed it, on his knee, made a small, quiet mark on the edge of his program for the following week. Tomorrow was Friday. The Wisengamot was waiting. Chapter 4, The Trial of the Dursleys. The Wisengamot chamber was older than the ministry building that contained it, which was itself old enough that the foundations had been laid when the surrounding streets were still farmland. The chamber predated the elevator shafts and the atrium fountain and every bureaucratic addition of the last 2 centuries. It was circular, tiered, stone, and it smelled of things that had accumulated in enclosed spaces for a very long time, old parchment, candle smoke, the particular mineral scent of deep underground air. 83 seats arranged in a horseshoe. A raised central floor for witnesses. The chief warlock's bench at the head, elevated above the rest. And today, for the first time in 4 years, every seat was occupied. They'd come for the Dursleys, officially. The charges against Vernon and Petunia had been compiled into a 17-page document that Amelia Bones had signed off on at midnight, and it covered facilitation of illegal charm application, criminal neglect, conspiracy to suppress a minor's magical development, and 3 additional charges that the ministry's legal team had spent 2 days finding the right statutory language for. But everyone in those 83 seats knew that the Dursleys were not the main event. The Dursleys were the door. What was behind the door was the question of who had put Harry in that house, who had cast the original charms, and how much the people in this room had known or suspected or chosen not to ask. Miriam arrived at 7:30 with Harry, who was wearing a set of plain dark robes that Miriam had sourced from a wizarding children's clothier, his first robes, and who walked into the Wisengamot's antechamber with the same unhurried, observational calm he brought to everything. He looked at the high ceilings and the carved walls and the portrait gallery of previous chief warlocks and said nothing, just looked, cataloguing. Amelia met them inside. She was in her formal DMLE robes, the emblem of the department on her chest, the kind of clothes that said this is official in the specific language of institutions. "How are you doing?" she asked Harry. "Fine," Harry said. He looked at the door to the main chamber. "How many people?" "Full chamber," Amelia said. 83 members. Plus the gallery, public observers. It'll be around 200 people total in the room. Harry processed this without any visible alteration in his breathing or his expression. "Who goes first?" he asked. The formal charges are read, the Dursleys are brought in and given the opportunity to respond, then witnesses are called in sequence. "You'll be later in the proceedings, not first." Amelia looked at him steadily. "If at any point you want to stop, you tell me." There's no shame in it. I know, Harry said. I won't want to stop. Amelia believed him. She showed it by not arguing. Ragnarok arrived at 7:52. He came through a side entrance that the Wisengamot's administrative office had, after some visible internal conflict, agreed to designate as the Goblin Nation's official entrance for the proceedings, which gave the Goblin Nation the same standing as the Ministry's prosecutorial team and the defense advocates, and which several members of the Wisengamot had objected to and been overruled on by Amelia's office, citing the Accord documents, which Amelia's office had read considerably more carefully than anyone else in the building. Ragnarok came with Sharpclaw, 2 legal aides, and a dignity that took up considerably more space than any of them did physically. He nodded at Harry when he saw him. Harry nodded back, the nod of 2 people who have already sorted out where they stand with each other. Ready? Ragnarok said. Yes, Harry said. Good. Ragnarok looked at the door to the chamber. This is going to be long and at times very dull. Legal proceedings always are. The important moments will be obvious when they arrive. How will I know? Harry asked. The room will go quiet, Ragnarok said. Not the polite quiet of procedure. The other kind. Harry filed that. At 8 o'clock the doors to the Wisengamot chamber opened. The charges took 40 minutes to read. The Wisengamot's clerk had a voice trained for carrying over stone and distance, and every count landed in the chamber with the weight of formal language, did knowingly and with malicious intent facilitate the sustained suppression of the magical core of one Harry James Potter, a minor, over a period of not less than 5 years, and the Dursleys sat in the witness enclosure at the center of the floor and heard it all. Vernon looked like a man who had been inflated and then slowly deflated. The red-faced certainty that was his default expression had collapsed into something gray and smaller, and he stared at a fixed point above the Chief Warlock's bench as though looking at anything nearer might require him to feel the room. He'd gotten his solicitor, a muggle one who had been obliviated twice in the corridor outside and replaced with a wizarding criminal advocate named Pitchforth who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Petunia did not look at a fixed point. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and she looked at them with an intensity that suggested she was examining something much more complicated than hands. When the charges were finished, the Chief Warlock, Tiberius Ogden, standing in for Dumbledore who held the position nominally but had, notably, not claimed the chair today, asked the defendants how they responded. Pitchforth stood. He spoke for several minutes about his client's understanding of the gravity of the situation, their cooperation with the investigation, the complexity of a case involving magical practices outside the defendant's own nature, and used the phrase well-intentioned if misguided at least 4 times. Vernon said nothing. He'd been told to say nothing. Petunia said, quietly, I would like to give my own statement. Pitchforth looked at her with the expression of an advocate who had specifically told his client not to do that. Madam Dursley, Ogden said, you understand that anything you say here is admissible and may be used in deliberations. Yes, Petunia said. She unfolded her hands. She looked up, not at Ogden but at the room, at all of it, at the 83 members and the gallery and the stone walls and the accumulated weight of centuries of magical law that she had spent her entire life on the outside of. I know. Very well, Ogden said. Petunia stood. She was thin, angular, her neck working the way necks worked when someone was managing something large down in the throat. I hated my sister, she said, and the chamber was immediately the good kind of quiet that Ragnarok had described. Not always. When we were children I thought she was the most extraordinary person I'd ever seen. And then she went to that school and she came back different, not different from magic, different from, she stopped. Restarted. From the world she went into. She looked at me differently. Like I was lesser. And I was angry about that for a very long time. Her hands were flat against the sides of her skirt. When she died and they left the boy on our doorstep with a letter from Dumbledore, and yes, his name was on the letter, I am saying it, I was angry about that too. That they thought we would just, that I would just, she pressed her lips together. Vernon didn't want him there. I didn't make him do anything. Mrs. Dursley, Pitchforth said, in a tone suggesting this was not the direction he'd intended. I'm not done, Petunia said, with a flatness that closed the conversation. She looked back at the chamber. When the man came, not Dumbledore himself, someone else, younger, when he came 6 months after we'd had the boy and said there were measures being put in place to protect Harry, I didn't ask what they were. I should have. He used the word protective and I chose to believe him because I didn't want to think about what I was agreeing to. I told myself it was magic things and I didn't understand magic and it wasn't my responsibility. Her voice hadn't broken yet. It was very controlled, the voice of someone who had been controlled for a long time. I'm telling you now that I knew it made him ill. I could see it. He was always thin, always tired, and I told myself it was just how he was. That's not true. I told myself what was convenient. She looked down at her hands again. I don't know if that's a crime in your world. I think it should be. The chamber was completely silent for a moment. Then Ogden said, carefully, Mrs. Dursley. You said someone came. A younger man. Can you describe him? 30s, Petunia said. Brown hair. Round face. Nervous. He had something on his left arm, under his sleeve, I saw it when he was leaving, he'd pushed the sleeve up. Looked like a brand. She looked up. I don't know what it means. Amelia Bones wrote something on her parchment in large, careful letters and underlined it. Across the chamber, in the gallery section that had been designated for official observers, Ragnarok was watching Petunia Dursley with the motionless attention of someone storing everything she said in a place it would not be lost. And in the anteroom, where a Medowitch was relaying the proceedings through a communication mirror, Harry Potter was sitting very still and listening to his aunt describe the mechanism by which his life had been arranged, her voice reaching him thin and slightly distorted through the mirror's silver surface, and his face was, as it had been since the day Miriam met him, entirely impossible to read, except for his eyes, which were doing the thing where they went very present and very focused. At the same time, like a lens being adjusted to the correct distance. That's useful, he said, when Petunia's statement concluded. Miriam, beside him, looked at him. The description, Harry clarified. Of the man who came. That's new information. That wasn't in any of the reports. He looked at the mirror. Amelia knows it now. Yes, Miriam said. Harry nodded, and went back to listening. The morning moved through its procedural stages with the stately, unhurried pace of official machinery. The DMLE's lead investigator presented findings. Expert witnesses on magical charm application testified. A healer from St Mungo's diagnostic division, not Miriam, who was designated as Harry's attending and therefore recused from the expert panel, testified about the medical findings in terms that made several members of the Wisengamot visibly uncomfortable and one of them asked for a brief recess. During the recess, Dumbledore arrived. He came in through the main doors, which required walking through the gallery and down to the chamber floor, and the effect of his entrance on the room was something Miriam, watching through the communication mirror, could see even in silver glass reproduction. The murmur, the shift, the collective turning of attention toward a person who generated attention the way certain landmarks generated tourists. He wore purple today, deep and formal, and he moved through the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been in more rooms like this one than most of the current occupants combined. He took a seat in the gallery. Not the witness area, he wasn't scheduled until after lunch. The gallery, where observers sat. Choosing his position carefully, as he chose everything. Harry, watching through the mirror, said, "He's early. He wants to see the room before he testifies," Miriam said. "He's preparing." "So am I," Harry said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I want to say," he said. "The important parts. The parts the reports don't have. Do you want to practice it?" "No," he said. "If I practice it, it sounds practiced. I want to say it like it is." Miriam sat back. She had nothing to add to that. Lunch was sandwiches in the anteroom, which Harry ate steadily without apparent appetite issues, which was still new enough to be remarkable to Miriam. The hunger had genuinely gone, not suppressed, not managed, actually gone. She watched him eat a second sandwich and didn't say anything about it, because there was nothing to say that wasn't just good. Keep going, you have 5 years of catching up to do. At 1 o'clock the afternoon session opened and Albus Dumbledore walked down from the gallery to the witness enclosure at the center of the chamber floor. He was sworn in. He stated his name, position, and relationship to the proceedings. He folded his hands on the rail of the enclosure and looked at the chamber with the patience of someone who knew he had the longer history with this room than anyone asking him questions. The DMLE's prosecutorial advocate, a sharp woman named Clearwater, no relation to the student, stood up. Headmaster Dumbledore. You were responsible for placing Harry Potter with the Dursley family on the 1st of November, 1981. I was, Dumbledore said. And you were aware at the time of the placement of the existence of a charm application to the child's magical core? A pause. Carefully measured. I was aware, Dumbledore said, that certain protective measures had been arranged. I was not fully briefed on their specific nature. But you were aware they existed? Yes. And in the 5 years following the placement, did you take any steps to monitor Harry Potter's physical and magical well-being? I had arrangements in place for specific steps, Headmaster. Did you personally, or through any agent acting on your instruction, visit Harry Potter in the Dursley home and assess his condition? Another pause. I relied on reports from, yes or no, please. Dumbledore's expression was perfectly maintained. No. Not personally. Did any agent acting on your instruction assess his condition in person? There were. He stopped. Chose again. Infrequently. The arrangements were less robust than they should have been. Clearwater let that sit in the room for a moment. Then, Healer Voss's diagnostic report documents the original charm cluster as professionally constructed, consistent with high-level magical training. Not consistent with the capability of either Vernon or Petunia Dursley, who are Muggles. Can you identify who applied the original charm cluster? I cannot, Dumbledore said. Cannot, or will not. Those charms, Dumbledore said, and now there was something in his voice, the bedrock certainty, quiet and enormous, were applied with the intention of protecting Harry Potter from those who would exploit his magical signature to find him. The wizarding world, for all its joy at his survival, contains individuals who would have used a 6-year-old child as a weapon. The measures, however poorly they were subsequently maintained, were a matter of survival. You're characterizing starvation charms as survival measures, Clearwater said. I am characterizing a complex and necessary set of decisions made in the immediate aftermath of a war, Dumbledore said, in which I was attempting to protect a child from multiple threats simultaneously. 71 threats, Clearwater said flatly. Over 5 years. The maintenance was not under my headmaster. Ogden, from the Chief Warlock's bench. The question of who performed the maintenance is an ongoing DMLE investigation. I'd like to keep this testimony focused on your direct knowledge. He looked at Clearwater. Continue. Clearwater consulted her parchment. She asked 14 more questions. Dumbledore answered every one with the care of a man building a structure, each answer placed precisely, the whole designed to hold weight from above. He acknowledged failures. He expressed regret in the formal, bounded way of someone who had decided the architecture of their regret in advance. He was, Miriam thought, watching through the mirror and eating nothing and barely blinking, extraordinary at this. At the management of a room. At being what the room expected, in exactly the proportions required. He was also, she thought, going to have a very significant problem in approximately 20 minutes. Harry came in at 2:30. He walked through the main chamber doors because that was the route the Wisengamot usher had shown him, and he walked down the central aisle between the tiered seats with his hands in his pockets and his robes neat and his face doing exactly what his face always did, nothing excessive, nothing performed, just that clear, even attention moving over the room and the people in it. He was 6 years old, and small, and the robes were slightly too long at the hem because wizarding children's sizing was not standardized and Miriam had bought the wrong size, but none of that mattered, because the room had gone quiet the moment the doors opened. Not politely quiet. The other kind. He stepped into the witness enclosure and the usher adjusted the speaking amplification charm to account for his height, which involved a brief, slightly undignified moment of the usher crouching, and Harry submitted to it without any visible embarrassment. "State your name for the record," Ogden said. "Harry James Potter," Harry said. His voice through the amplification charm was clear and even. He looked at Ogden directly. Then he looked at the chamber, a full, slow scan, taking in every row, every face, the gallery, Ragnarok in his designated section, Miriam in hers. And then, last, Dumbledore, who was still seated in the gallery because he'd finished his testimony but had not left. Harry looked at him for exactly the same amount of time he'd looked at everything else. Not longer. Not with any additional charge. Just the same even attention. Then he looked back at Ogden. "You're 6 years old," Ogden said, and immediately followed it with, "I apologize, that was unnecessary." "Harry, you've been informed of the voluntary nature of your testimony?" "Yes," Harry said. "Healer Voss and Madame Bones both told me." "And you're here voluntarily?" "Yes." Ogden looked at the chamber, at the prosecutorial desk, at the defense table where Pitchforth was sitting with his notes and the expression of a man attending his own funeral. "Given the witness's age, I'll be moderating questioning directly rather than deferring entirely to counsel. Both parties may submit questions through me." He looked back at Harry. "I'd like to begin simply, if I may. Can you tell the chamber, in your own words, what your life in the Dursley household was like?" Harry was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain, settling into it, the way he settled into anything that required precision. "I lived in a cupboard under the stairs," he said. "It's a small space under the staircase in a house. My cousin had a bedroom. My aunt and uncle had a bedroom. There was a guest room. I had the cupboard. There was a lock on the outside." He paused. "I was hungry most of the time. Not because they didn't have food, they had plenty. I was given less of it. When I asked why I was always hungry, my aunt told me I ate what I was given and I should be grateful." Another pause. "I didn't know there were charms on me. I knew I felt wrong, always. Heavy and flat and very quiet inside. I thought that was how everyone felt. The chamber was the right kind of quiet. My cousin was allowed to hit me," Harry continued, same even voice, same unhurried pace. "My uncle was allowed to hit me. If something went wrong in the house, if something broke or spilled or if my cousin did something and blamed me, I was punished for it. I did most of the housework from the time I was big enough to reach things." He looked at Ogden. "I don't say this because I want the people in this room to feel sorry for me. I say it because those are the facts, and the people deciding things should have the facts." Several members of the Wisingamot were not successfully controlling their expressions. One of them, Miriam recognized him from Amelia's briefing, Titus Greengrass, one of the more aggressively traditional members, put his hand up for a submitted question. Ogden acknowledged him. The question came through: "Did any adult in the Muggle world ever become aware of your circumstances and fail to act?" Harry thought about it. "Teachers at my school knew I was thinner than other children. One teacher, she retired when I was 4, used to give me extra food at lunch and I think she knew, but she never," he paused. "Nobody ever came to investigate. I think my aunt and uncle were good at making things look normal." Greengrass, who had asked the question expecting, Miriam suspected, ammunition against the Muggle world and perhaps a deflection from the magical one, sat back with the expression of a man whose question had not gone the way he planned. Another question, through Ogden: "Harry, you mentioned you didn't know there were charms on you. Do you know now who applied them?" "Not who applied the first ones," Harry said. "Healer Voss told me the original cluster was professionally done. I know Dumbledore, the man in the gallery, there, he did not point, just indicated with the specific direction of his attention, knew about them. He told her he was aware. He paused. I don't know if he applied them himself. That seems like something the investigation should determine. He looked at Ogden. But I know he placed me with the Dursleys, and I know he didn't check on me in person in 6 years, and I know that the charms kept being maintained and added to, and I think, he stopped. Looked at the chamber. I think if someone had actually come to see me at any point, they would have known immediately that things were wrong. They just didn't come. Nobody submitted another question for almost 10 seconds, which in a room of 83 people was a very long time. Then Pitchforth, the defense advocate, submitted a question through Ogden, and Ogden read it in a voice that suggested some personal reservations. Harry, given your age and the fact that you have no memories of your parents' death or the events surrounding it, is it possible that your understanding of your situation has been shaped by others' interpretations rather than your own direct experience? The question was designed to create doubt. Miriam, in her gallery seat, felt a spike of pure anger and kept her face still. Harry looked at the defense table. Then back at Ogden. I understand what that question is trying to do, Harry said. His voice was completely level. It's suggesting that maybe I don't know what I experienced. But the charms are documented. Healer Voss found 71 of them, she dated them, she described them. That's not my interpretation. The cupboard under the stairs is a room in a real house that can be verified. My weight and bone density records at the Muggle hospital are facts. What I'm telling you is what I lived. I'm 6, not stupid. Pitchforth did not submit any further questions. Dumbledore, in the gallery, was looking at Harry with an expression that Miriam had not seen from him before. It was not guilt, exactly, and it was not the warm certainty he usually projected. It was something more complicated and more interesting, the expression of someone encountering something that didn't fit the shape they'd built to contain it. He had planned, she suspected, for a child. A small, tearful, overwhelmable child who could be managed through the proceedings, whose testimony could be sympathized with and then contextualized by his own. He had not planned for Harry. Ogden thanked Harry and indicated he could step down. Harry stepped out of the witness enclosure, walked back up the central aisle, and came through the doors into the anteroom where Miriam was waiting. She had a glass of water ready. He took it, drank half, and sat down. How did it go? He asked. You know how it went, she said. You were there. I know what I said. I can't see the room the same way from inside it. He looked at her. Did it do what I wanted it to do? What did you want it to do? Make the facts impossible to avoid, he said. The facts were already in the reports. But reports sit on desks. If they hear me say it, he set the glass down. People find it harder to not think about something if someone who was there says it out loud. Miriam looked at this child, this extraordinary, infuriating, entirely unique child, and thought, not for the first time, that the people who had designed his cage had done so because they'd understood, on some level, what would happen if they didn't. It worked, she said. He nodded. He picked up the glass again, finished the water, and looked at the door to the chamber. What happens now? He asked. The Wisengamot deliberates. Could be today, could be tomorrow morning. She paused. And Ragnarok presents the formal claims summary to the chamber after the criminal proceedings. They won't like that, Harry said. Many of them won't, no. Good, Harry said, straightforward as always. They should have to sit with both things at once. What was done to me, and what they let happen to their own agreements. He paused. It's the same failure. They should see it's the same failure. Miriam opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Harry, she said. Did you just outline the entire political strategy of this week in one sentence? Harry looked at her with mild surprise, as though the connection had been obvious. Ragnarok said it, Harry said. Last week, during tea. He said the two things had to land together, the moral case and the legal case, because separately, people can choose which one to engage with and ignore the other. Together, they have to answer for both. Miriam thought about the tea session, the mathematics, the goblin numbering systems, the apparently casual conversation. She thought about Ragnar's pen making that small mark on the edge of his program. "He told you that deliberately," she said. "We told each other," Harry said. It was a conversation. She sat with that for a moment. Then the chamber doors opened and the usher appeared to tell them the criminal deliberation would be brief, preliminary findings in 20 minutes, and that the Goblin Nation's formal presentation would follow immediately after. Harry stood up. He straightened his robes. "One more thing," Miriam said. He looked at her. "After this," she said, "we need to talk about where you're going to live." Something moved across his face, not anxiety, but the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a specific topic to arrive. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "Of course you have," Miriam said. "I want a say," he said. "I'm not going somewhere because someone decided." "You'll have a say," she said. "I promise you that." He held her eyes for a moment to confirm she meant it, which she did, and which apparently read clearly enough, because he nodded and turned toward the door. The preliminary findings took 15 minutes, not 20. The Wisengamot voted 71 to 12 in favor of proceeding to formal conviction on all counts against Vernon Desley. For Petunia, the vote was split differently, 53 to 30, with the remainder abstaining, and the counts were reduced in acknowledgement of her testimony, though not eliminated. Sentences would be determined at a separate hearing with full Wisengamot deliberation. Vernon, when the first vote was read, made a sound that was quickly suppressed by Pitchforth's hand on his arm. Petunia looked at her hands. Just her hands. Whatever she had decided to feel about all of this, she was keeping it entirely internal. Then Ogden announced the transition to the Accord presentation, and Ragnar walked to the center of the chamber floor. He didn't use the witness enclosure. He stood beside it, slightly to the left, in the open floor of the chamber, and he waited for the room to settle, and then he looked at the 83 members of the Wisengamot with the amber eyes and the ancient carved face of something that had been patient for 200 years and was now, in a very specific and carefully measured way, done. "The Goblin Nation," he said, and his voice carried without amplification, which was itself a kind of statement, has maintained the Accord of 1289 for 537 years. "We have managed your wealth, secured your inheritance, and protected your financial history through wars and changes of government and the deaths of ministries more competent than the current one." He paused, one beat, two. "In exchange, you agreed to a set of conditions. I have filed the specific breaches with this chamber. My legal team has provided documentation. I am not here to argue the figures are the figures, and I'm told your own legal department confirmed them this morning and found no errors." Silence. "What I am here to tell you," Ragnar said, "is that this is not a negotiation about money. The money is what it is and it will be paid. What this is a negotiation about is whether the next 500 years look like the last 500 years, or whether they look like something better. The Accord has provisions that have never been implemented, provisions for Goblin representation in financial oversight, for recognition of Goblin intellectual property rights in created artifacts, for co-governance of certain areas of magical law where our expertise has historically exceeded yours." He looked at the chamber with complete calm. "We are owed those provisions. We are also owed an accounting for the child. Both of those things are true and neither one cancels the other." A member of the Wisengamot, Miriam didn't know his name, a heavy-set man in the second row, said, loudly enough that his words needed no amplification, "This is coercion." Ragnar looked at him. "No," he said. "Coercion is what you do to someone who has no legal standing. I have 537 years of legal standing. This is enforcement." Another member, "The Goblin Nation has no right to demand representation in, page 12, Ragnar said. Clause 7. 1289, your predecessor agreed to it. Their signatures are on the document. I have the original. He waited. Would you like to see it? The member sat back. The full remedy schedule, Ragnarok continued, has been distributed to each member of this chamber. I am requesting a response from the Ministry of Magic within 14 days. Not deliberation. Not a committee. A response. If no response is received within 14 days, the Goblin Nation will move to the next stage of enforcement, which is detailed on page 44 of the document you have all received. He paused. It will be disruptive. Ogden, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man who'd been a lawyer long enough to recognize when someone had built an airtight case and simply needed the room to walk around inside it, said, the Wisengamot will take the claim under formal consideration. 14 days, Ragnarok said. Not a threat. Just a date. He walked back to his section. Sharpclaw had a quill ready. He sat down, and she slid a document in front of him, and he signed it, the same complex character as before, in the same one continuous motion, and the room was still doing the quiet thing, both kinds at once now. In the anteroom, Harry had his ear to the door. He pulled it back when Miriam appeared beside him. Well, he said. 14 days, she said. He looked satisfied. That's enough time, he said. For what? For Fudge to panic, Harry said, and then realize he has no good options, and then accept that Ragnarok knew that before he walked in. He paused. Ragnarok always knows how many options the other side has. Miriam stared at him. We talked about it, Harry said. During tea. She was going to have to start taking notes during tea. They left the Wisengamot at 4 o'clock, into the late afternoon of the ministry atrium, and Harry looked up at the golden fountain, the statue of the wizard family, triumphant and central and surrounded by lesser creatures gazing admiringly upward, and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then he looked at Miriam. That's going to change, he said. He said it the way he said everything that was a fact, flat, calm, certain. Yes, Miriam said. I expect it is. He looked at it one more time. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator bank, his two long robes sweeping the floor, and Miriam went with him, and the atrium fountain stood where it had stood for a century, gleaming in gold and exactly as it had always been, for the moment. Just for the moment. Chapter 5, The Shape of War. The 14 days didn't last 14 days. On the morning of day 9, someone inside the ministry, nobody ever conclusively identified who, though Amelia Bones had 3 very strong suspicions and one of them involved a filing clerk on the 4th floor who handed in his resignation the following week, leaked the full Accord remedy schedule to every major wizarding publication in Britain and 6 international ones. By noon the Daily Prophet had it across the front page. By 2 o'clock the International Warlock in Germany had run a translation. By 4, the New World Wizarding Dispatch out of New York had picked it up with the headline British Goblin King sends Ministry 14-day ultimatum. What does page 44 say? Page 44 said, in language that Sharpclaw had spent 3 days making precisely, legally unambiguous, that in the event of ministry non-compliance, the Goblin Nation would exercise its rights under Clause 31 of the Accord, the Enforcement Clause, which had been inserted in 1447 after the Greengrass affair and which allowed the Goblin Nation to physically occupy any ministry-controlled financial institution in Britain and conduct an audit under Goblin authority until such time as the breach was remedied. The word occupy was doing a lot of work in the public imagination. By that evening, Fudge had held 2 press conferences, neither of which said anything, and the Wisengamot had called an emergency subcommittee meeting that produced a statement describing the situation as regrettable but manageable that Ragnarok read with the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this and had already planned for it. Harry read it over breakfast at St Mungo's. He was still in the hospital, technically, though Miriam was preparing his discharge for the end of the week, and put the paper down and said, "They're going to run out the clock." Miriam looked up from her own copy. "They're hoping something changes in the next 5 days," Harry said. They think if they wait long enough Ragnak will either accept a partial settlement or he'll move on enforcement and they can call it aggression and shift the public conversation. He picked up his toast. But Ragnak won't accept partial, and if they call it aggression it'll be the Accord language against the Ministry's spin, and the Accord language is 500 years old and in writing. You've been talking to Ragnak, Miriam said. He sends a note every morning, Harry said. Just a paragraph. What happened yesterday, what he expects today. He looked at her. He says it helps to have someone to think out loud to who doesn't have a position yet. Miriam put her copy of the paper down. Harry, you're 6. I know, he said. He says that's why it works. I don't have institutional loyalty to anything yet, so when I say something's obvious it's because it actually is. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window London was doing its usual grey and gold morning performance, and Harry was eating his toast and reading the rest of the paper with the focused attention he gave everything, and she thought about what Okafor had said, the people who are going to have to figure out what to do with you, and thought that the figuring out was going to take considerably longer than anyone had planned. Your discharge is Saturday, she said. He put the paper down. He looked at her. I've been talking to Amelia, Miriam said. And to Ragnak. And to a few other people. She paused. We've been trying to find the right arrangement. Someone appropriate, safe, with a genuine connection to you or your family and no political exposure to Dumbledore. Who? Harry asked. There are a few options, she said carefully. But the strongest one, legally cleanest, personally most appropriate, is Sirius Black. Harry was very still. He was your father's best friend, Miriam said. He was named your godfather in your parents' will, which was read by the Ministry but never acted on because he was imprisoned at Azkaban after the, she paused. After a short time after your parents died. He was in prison, Harry said. Flat, not accusatory. Just confirming. He was. But the conviction, Miriam said, choosing every word, was done without a trial. We found that out 3 days ago. Amelia pulled the original records. There was no trial. No evidence presented. He was sent directly to Azkaban on the word of a single Ministry official. She met Harry's eyes. He's been there for 5 years for something he was never formally convicted of. The room was very quiet. Like me, Harry said. Miriam blinked. He was put somewhere terrible based on someone's decision, Harry said, and nobody checked, and nobody fixed it. His voice hadn't changed pitch. Hadn't acquired any dramatic weight. He just stated it, and it landed anyway, because it was exactly right. Who made the decision? The arrest record has one name on it, Miriam said. Bartemius Crouch Sr. Head of the DMLE at the time. Harry filed it. And Dumbledore? Not on the arrest record, Miriam said. But the timing, she paused. The timing of Sirius's arrest and the timing of your placement are the same week. Harry was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands on the table. Then, does Sirius know about me? About what happened? We've sent word through Amelia's office. Miriam paused, and something in her face shifted. He was very ill when they found him. 5 years in Azkaban is, she stopped again. He's being treated. He knows you're safe. He asked about you before he asked about anything else, including his own situation. Harry looked at the window. Can I meet him? He said. Soon, Miriam said. He needs a bit more time. Okay, Harry said. He looked back at his paper. He finished his toast. And then, because he was 6 and because underneath everything he was still that, he said, he asked about me first. First thing, Miriam said. Harry nodded. He went back to the paper, and Miriam went back to her tea, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Day 11. Ragnar's note to Harry that morning was 4 paragraphs instead of 1, and Harry read it twice and then sent a reply that was 2 lines long. The reply, filtered back through the communication channel that Sharpclaw had established, an encrypted two-way scroll system, technically a banking communication tool repurposed for correspondence, read, "They'll move the money before day 14. Not all of it. Enough to complicate the audit. You should be in position before they try." Ragnar read it. He showed it to Sharpclaw without comment. Sharpclaw read it. "He's right," she said. "I know," Ragnar said. "He's 6, she said, which was becoming something people said in the same tone as "the sky is blue," not as an objection, just as a thing that needed periodic confirmation because it kept being surprising. "He's also James Potter's son," Ragnar said, "and Lily Evans's son, and he's been running calculations about the people around him since before he could read because it was the only tool he had." He folded the scroll. "We moved to preposition today." Prepositioning, in the Goblin Nation's operational vocabulary, was the polite term for what happened next. It looked like a normal morning at Gringotts. The bronze doors opened at 9 as they always did. The human goblins behind the counters processed the usual transactions, withdrawals, deposits, vault access requests, with the usual impassive efficiency. The tourists and the regulars came through, did their business, left. Nothing visible changed. But between 9 a.m. and noon on day 11, quietly and without announcement, 240 Goblin Nation legal representatives apparat to positions outside the 11 ministry-controlled financial institutions scattered across Britain, the Ministry Vaults Complex in Whitehall, the Wizarding Investment Bureau in Edinburgh, the 9 regional magical revenue offices from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. They didn't enter. They stood outside, in small groups, in the ordinary way of people who were simply present. Each of them carried sealed documents. Each of them had clause 31 in their breast pocket. Each of them had a watch, and all of the watches were synchronized. They had instructions for day 14. By the afternoon, the ministry's intelligence office knew they were there. By evening, Fudge knew. He called the emergency meeting of his senior staff for 7 o'clock, which was the 3rd emergency meeting in 9 days and was getting increasingly difficult to distinguish from the previous ones in terms of its output, which was very little. Amelia Bones was in the meeting. She sat in the corner of the conference room with her arms folded and let the men argue for 40 minutes about whether Ragnar was bluffing, a question she had already answered for herself and found uninteresting. When the arguing ran down, she said, "He's not bluffing. The question isn't whether to let him enforce. He'll enforce either way. The question is what we want the narrative to be when he does." The minister looked at her. "What are our options?" "Settle before day 14, she said. "Full remedies, the accord provisions, the guardianship clause on Harry Potter, the lot. We control the statement, we call it a historic agreement, we look like we acted with integrity. The cost," someone started, "is significant and non-negotiable," Amelia said. "That's what happens when you ignore a 500-year-old contract for 120 years. The interest compounds." She looked around the room. "Or we wait," he enforces, "we call it an invasion, the public narrative becomes hostile, and we spend the next 2 years in the worst press coverage the wizarding world has seen since the last war, while Ragnar still gets everything he was going to get anyway, plus the moral high ground." Silence. Fudge rubbed his face under the brim of the hat he hadn't removed even in the meeting room. "If we settle, we announce it," Amelia said. "Tuesday morning. Joint statement, Ministry and Goblin Nation. We frame it around Harry, the accord provisions as a consequence of what was done to him, the settlement as the right response to systemic failure." She paused. "It lets us look like we're fixing something rather than being forced into it." Another man, the head of finance, Miriam had never met him, Amelia had pointed him out at the Wisengamot session, a thin precise man named Bagley who always looked like he was doing arithmetic, said, "The Dumbledore question." "What about it?" Amelia said. "If we settle with Ragnar and announce it as fixing a systemic failure, we're implicitly acknowledging that the systemic failure includes decisions that were made at the highest levels. Bagley looked at her steadily. We're acknowledging Dumbledore. We're acknowledging the situation, Amelia said. Dumbledore's formal censure vote is a separate Wisengamot matter and it will proceed separately. He has considerable support in the Wisengamot. He had considerable support, Amelia said. The Wisengamot voted 71-12 on the Dursley charges. Several of those 71 are the same people who've spent 20 years deferring to Dumbledore on everything. That number is changing. She stood up. My recommendation is to settle. I need an answer by tomorrow morning because Ragnarok's operational teams are already in position and I'd rather they stand down before Tuesday than have to decide whether to arrest 240 Goblin legal representatives for loitering. She left the meeting. She went to her office, poured herself a very small measure of fire whiskey, and sent a message by Patronus to Miriam Voss. It said, "Tell Harry he was right about the money. They're deciding tonight." Harry got the message at 9 p.m. He was reading, a different book now, one Ragnarok had sent through the scroll system, a history of Goblin banking law that was technically a legal reference text but which Harry was treating as recreational reading, which said everything. He set it down, looked at the small glowing otter that had delivered the message, Amelia's Patronus, a sleek purposeful thing that suited her entirely, and then looked at Miriam. Good, he said. She's not saying they've settled, Miriam said. She's saying they're deciding. They'll settle, Harry said. They've run the same calculation Ragnarok ran and they know what the answer is. He picked his book back up. Ragnarok knew they'd settle before he filed the claim. The enforcement was always a last resort that he was prepared to use if necessary, but he designed the whole thing so that settling would be the rational choice by day 11. And if they hadn't calculated correctly? Then we'd be watching something interesting on Thursday, Harry said, turning a page. Either way. Miriam looked at him over the top of her own paperwork, which was the ongoing documentation work that had become her primary occupation for the past 10 days. Harry, she said. When you get to Hogwarts in 5 years, the teachers are going to have a very interesting time. He looked up. Because you are going to find classroom learning, she paused, looking for the right word. Limiting. He thought about this seriously. Maybe, he said. But there'll be a library. He looked back at his book. Libraries are good anywhere. She had no argument for that. Day 12. The ministry settled. The announcement came out at 11 a.m. in a joint statement from Fudge's office and from Gringotts, the Gringotts portion written by Sharpclaw and visible as such because it was the half that was grammatically precise and legally complete. The ministry portion was Amelia's framing, historic reaffirmation of the Accord of 1289, commitment to the full implementation of provisions long agreed upon, recognition of past failures and the protection of all magical citizens including minors. The figure was not published. But it was paid. Ragnarok had the transfer confirmed by Gringotts' internal accounting before the statement went public, because he had not survived 200 years in financial diplomacy by trusting announcements over receipts. The Goblin Nation's 240 legal representatives stood down from their positions outside the ministry financial institutions at 11:47 a.m., not because the statement came out but because Ragnarok sent the signal at 11:47 a.m., which was approximately 3 minutes after the internal accounting confirmed the first tranche of the settlement transfer. In Ragnarok's office, 6 levels below the lobby, the pending drawer was labeled differently by end of day. Sharpclaw had replaced the label herself, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to do it for a long time. The new label read, in gobbledygook, Potter, active. Protected. Harry was officially discharged from St Mungo's on Saturday morning. He didn't have much to pack because he hadn't arrived with anything. Miriam had accumulated a pile of things over the course of his stay, the books, the notes he'd made in the margin of his hospital stationery, a small collection of objects that had ended up in his room for various reasons, including one of the light spheres that had rematerialized 3 days after the last charm removal, smaller now, the size of a large marble, floating at about ear height wherever he went and which he appeared to have simply accepted as a feature of his existence. The sphere had gone through Miriam's diagnostic scope twice. It was stable. It was entirely benign. It was also, as far as she could establish, a continuous self-sustaining magical construct that Harry maintained without any conscious effort whatsoever and which appeared to function as a kind of ambient expression of his mood, brighter when he was engaged or pleased, dimmer and slower when he was tired. She had 3 pages of notes on it. Okafor had 6. She packed his things into a bag, a proper one, from a wizarding children's supply shop, dark green with a self-organizing charm on the interior pockets, and she put the books in and the notes and the few other things, and Harry watched her do it from the bed where he was sitting with his shoes already on. "Where am I going today?" he asked. "My house," Miriam said. "Temporarily. While Sirius's recovery continues and the legal paperwork for the formal guardianship goes through Gringotts for certification." She'd offered this 10 days ago and meant it then and meant it now. She lived alone in a house in magical London that had 3 bedrooms and a very large garden and was 15 minutes from St Mungo's by Flo, and she had no children of her own and approximately no idea how to raise a 6-year-old, but she had spent 10 days getting to know this particular 6-year-old and she thought that what he needed most was not expertise in child rearing but someone who would answer questions honestly and make sure there was always enough food. She felt reasonably confident about both. "How long is temporarily?" Harry asked. "Weeks, probably. Maybe a month." "Sirius is," she chose her words. "He's working through things. 5 years in Azkaban isn't something you recover from quickly. But he's asked about you every day." Harry nodded. He picked up his bag when she held it out. He looked around the room, the bed, the window, the chair, the place where he'd woken up after the last charm came off and looked at his hands in the new morning light. "I won't miss it," he said, "but I'm glad I was here." "So am I," Miriam said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something he hadn't done before, he walked across the room and hugged her, which given that he was 6 and she was 43 required some height adjustment on her part, and he did it quickly and without any of the emotional orchestration that might have turned it into a significant moment. Just walked across the room and put his arms around her for 3 seconds and then stepped back and picked up his bag again. Miriam straightened up. She arranged her face. "Right," she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady. "Flo powder's in my bag. I'll go through first and you come after." "Okay," Harry said. The little light sphere bobbed gently at his ear height, slightly brighter than usual. She went through first. He followed, stepping out of the fireplace into her sitting room with the practiced ease of someone who'd been told exactly what to do and done it precisely, arriving in a shower of green sparks with his bag over his shoulder and the sphere still orbiting his head and those green eyes taking in her sitting room with the same calm, cataloguing attention he'd given every new room since the hospital. He looked at the bookshelves. He looked at the garden through the window. He looked back at her. "The library," he started. "Second door on the left upstairs," she said. "It's not a library exactly, more of an overloaded study, but there are more books than I've read, so." He was already moving toward the stairs. "Lunch is at 1, she called after him. "Okay," he called back, and she heard the second door on the left open and then a pause of pure, pleased silence that she interpreted correctly as the silence of someone confronting a very large number of books for the first time. She put the kettle on. The Dumbledore censure vote was called for the following Tuesday. It wasn't a criminal trial, the evidence for direct involvement in the charm application hadn't yet solidified into the kind of airtight case Amelia needed to charge him, though the investigation was ongoing and Petunia's description of the man with the brand on his arm had opened a line of inquiry that was getting warmer. The censure was a Wisengamot proceeding, a formal institutional rebuke, and it carried consequences: removal from the position of chief warlock, a period of oversight review, and a public record that was not the same as a criminal conviction but was, in its way, more durable. Dumbledore had spent the days since the Wisengamot session doing what he did, meeting with people, having conversations, managing the narrative with the extraordinary patient skill of someone who had been managing narrative since before most of his opponents were born. He'd spoken with 12 Wizengamot members. He'd published a statement expressing deep personal regret. He'd sent a letter to Harry through Amelia's office that was graceful and careful and measured, and which Harry had read once, set aside, and not mentioned again. Miriam had not asked about the letter. She would, eventually. But Harry would bring it up when he was ready, and pushing before then would be a mistake. Monday evening, Harry came downstairs from the study with 3 books under his arm and sat across from Miriam at the kitchen table where she was doing her St Mungo's documentation. "The censure vote is tomorrow," he said. "Yes. Will it pass?" She looked up from her parchment. "Amelia thinks yes." Narrowly. Harry set his books down. "He's been talking to people," Harry said. "Trying to change the count." "Yes. Will it work?" Miriam thought about it honestly. "Some of it will. He's very good at it." But the Wizengamot voted 71-12 on the Dursley charges, and 12 days later Ragnarok's settlement is done and in the papers, and the public conversation has shifted. She met his eyes. The ground has moved under him. He's very good at working within a system, but the system changed. Harry looked at the table for a moment. Then, what happens to him if the censure passes? He loses Chief Warlock. He'll still be headmaster of Hogwarts, that's the Hogwarts board, separate from the Wizengamot. He'll still be, she paused. He'll still be Albus Dumbledore. He'll still have influence. But less, Harry said. Yes. And accountability. Which is different from less. Harry was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to destroy him," he said. He thought he was doing the right thing. He was wrong, but it wasn't. He paused, finding the edges of it. It wasn't nothing. He thought it was right. "Yes," Miriam said carefully. "But thinking you're right isn't enough," Harry said. "You have to actually be right. And when you're not, there should be something that says so." He picked up one of his books. "That's what the censure is. Something that says so." Miriam looked at him. "You're not angry at him," she said. "Not a question." "I'm angry at what happened," Harry said. "The situation. The fact that nobody checked. The fact that," he stopped. His eyes went to the middle distance for a moment, and in that moment he looked exactly his age, which he didn't often. "The fact that it was so long," he said, quietly. 6 years. It didn't have to be 6 years. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. It was true and it didn't need framing. After a moment Harry blinked and came back to the room, and he opened his book, and she went back to her documentation, and they sat in the kitchen for an hour in the comfortable quiet of people who had learned to share silence without filling it. At 9 o'clock Harry went to bed. The little light sphere went with him, drifting up the stairs at ear height, steady and warm. Miriam sat at the table for a while after and thought about the week, about Ragnarok in the Wizengamot chamber and Harry in the witness enclosure and Petunia's hands and Vernon's grey face. About a settlement that had restructured the financial architecture of the wizarding world in 12 days. About a 6-year-old sitting in a hospital room with his ear to the door and a book about banking law on his knee. She thought about what Okafor had said, "I genuinely don't know what you'll be capable of. I don't think anyone does." She thought that this was probably going to be the most important thing she ever did, and she had stumbled into it on a Tuesday afternoon in a Muggle hospital because she was the duty healer when the alert came through, and she thought that this was how most important things probably happened, not by design, not through heroism, but because someone was paying attention when attention was required, and they didn't look away. She cleaned up the kitchen, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Tomorrow was Tuesday. The vote would come down. And somewhere in Miriam's study, between a book about banking law and a book about mathematics and a book about the history of the world, Harry Potter was asleep with a light sphere floating at the height of his pillow, steady as a star, entirely and completely his own. Chapter 6, The Shape of After the Censure Vote Passed 58 to 25. It came down at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday in early August, and Miriam heard it through the communications mirror in her kitchen while Harry was upstairs. The Wisingamot clerk read the result in the flat administrative voice of someone who had read results of votes for 30 years and had learned not to put anything into them, and the number sat in the room, 58 to 25, and then the session was adjourned and that was that. She went to the bottom of the stairs. "Harry," she called. A pause. The sound of a book being set down. "Yes." The censure passed. A longer pause. "Okay," he said, and then the book sound came back. She went back to the kitchen and made tea and thought about what 58 to 25 meant. It meant 33 people who 6 months ago would have voted the other way. It meant the ground had moved, exactly as she'd told him it would. It meant Dumbledore was no longer Chief Warlock, was no longer the unquestioned apex of British wizarding institutional authority, was now a man with a public record of failure attached to his name in permanent Wisingamot ink. It also meant 25 people who had voted no, and she was not naive enough to think that number was irrelevant. She was on her second cup when Harry came downstairs. He was carrying the banking law book and he sat down across from her and poured himself the glass of juice that was now a standing morning fixture on the table and looked out the window at the garden. 25 voted against, he said. "Yes. That's the number to watch," he said. "Not because they'll undo it. They can't. But they're the ones who'll be making things difficult later. Later, Miriam said, is going to take care of itself." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and she put enough into it that he got the message, which was, "You don't have to solve everything today." He got it. He nodded, once. He opened his book. She let herself look at him for a moment, this child who had arrived at a Muggle hospital 2.5 weeks ago with 71 chains on him and the particular hollowness of something that had been deliberately starved, and who was now sitting in her kitchen in the morning light with his juice and his book and the little sphere of light orbiting his head, putting on weight, sleeping full nights, occasionally laughing at things in books and looking briefly embarrassed about it. He was going to be all right. Not in the soft, hopeful way people meant when they said it. In the actual way, the structural way, the way that meant he was building something real. She was fairly certain about that. She was also fairly certain that the next 5 years were going to be extraordinary and difficult and that the wizarding world was absolutely not prepared for what it had set free, and that this was, on the whole, correct. Sirius Black was released from Azkaban on a Thursday. The formal exoneration came through Amelia's office, signed by the minister himself under considerable pressure, citing the absence of trial records and the discovery of evidence that substantially undermined the original basis for arrest. The investigation into what had actually happened on the night Sirius was taken was still ongoing, tangled in the same web of questions that Petunia's description of the man with the brand was pulling at, but the legal threshold for release had been cleared and Amelia had pushed it through with the particular focused efficiency she applied to things she considered overdue. He arrived at St Mungo's for observation on Thursday afternoon, and Miriam got the notification and showed it to Harry at dinner. Harry read the notification. He looked at it for a long time. "Can I go?" he asked. "Not today," Miriam said. "He's just arrived and they need to assess him first. But soon. This week, if his healers agree." "What's he like?" Harry asked. He'd asked this before, in different forms, each time approaching the question from a slightly different angle, the way you circled around a thing you were thinking about carefully. "I haven't met him," Miriam said. "Amelia has. She says she used the word intact, which given what he's been through is significant." She paused. "She also said the first coherent thing he said when they got him out was to ask whether you were actually safe or whether they were just telling him that." Harry looked at his dinner. "They told him you were safe," Miriam said, "and he asked how they knew, and Amelia told him about the Wisingamot session and your testimony, and she said he was quiet for a bit and then he said," she stopped, because the exact quote from Amelia's mirror message had been he said, "That's James's kid all right," and then he cried for about 10 minutes and wouldn't talk to anyone, but the healers said that was probably healthy. She'd decided not to quote all of that. What did he say? Harry asked, not looking up. He said it sounded like you, Miriam said, which was close enough to true. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating, and the little sphere did one slow orbit at elevated brightness and then settled back. Friday morning, Harry was doing what he did most mornings, which was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the garden with a book open on his knee and his eyes closed. He'd started doing this 3 days after his discharge, just going to sit in the garden, and Miriam had watched from the kitchen window the first time with careful attention and concluded after 20 minutes that he was not meditating in any formal sense, he was simply sitting with his magic, feeling it, the way you might put your hand in moving water just to feel the movement. Sometimes things happened in the garden while he sat. The grass grew slightly faster in the ring around him. Flowers that had been closed opened. Once a small bird had landed on his knee and sat there for 4 minutes while he continued to read with the calm acceptance of someone who found this entirely unsurprising. This morning she watched the sphere do something new. It had been its usual marble size for the past week, but as Harry sat in the garden with his book and his eyes half closed, it began to expand, slowly, with the deliberateness of something being shaped, until it was the size of a football, floating at eye height in front of him. And then he opened his eyes and looked at it, and it held his gaze, and he reached out and put his finger on its surface, and it split. Not violently. Not even dramatically. It simply divided into 2 equal spheres, clean as a cell dividing under a microscope, and both spheres hung in the air in front of him, steady and matching. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he split each of them again. 4 spheres. He split them again. 8. He looked at the 8 spheres arranged in the air around him and then, with the particular expression of someone testing a hypothesis, he waved his hand and they rearranged themselves, a straight line, then a circle, then a complex 3-dimensional pattern that Miriam, watching from the window with her tea mug frozen halfway to her mouth, thought looked like a constellation. Then Harry went back to his book, and the 8 spheres settled into orbit around him like small planets, and he turned a page. Miriam went back to her tea. She wrote Okafor a very short message that said, 8 now. Can arrange patterns. Still apparently unconscious. Come for tea this week. His reply came back in 15 minutes, absolutely yes, and I'm bringing a second diagnostic case. The visit to St Mungo's to see Sirius was arranged for the following Monday. Miriam went with Harry, because she was still his primary healer of record and because she wasn't going to send him in alone, and also because she was genuinely curious about Sirius Black in a way she hadn't been about most of the other principals in this situation. She'd read Amelia's assessment, intact, that carefully chosen word, and she'd read the original arrest report, which was the single most procedurally deficient document she'd seen outside of a training exercise in how not to conduct a legal process, and she had formed a view that what 5 years in Azkaban had done to a person who hadn't even committed the crime was something she needed to see in order to properly understand. They were shown to a private room on the 2nd floor. Sirius's attending healer, a careful, quiet man named Aldus who Miriam knew professionally, met them in the corridor first. He's better than he was Thursday, Aldous said. He's eating, he's coherent, he's sleeping with the dreamless sleep and we're starting to wean that back. He looked at Harry with a professional assessment that Harry submitted to with patient stillness. He knows you're coming. He's been better since he knew. How should I, Harry started, and then stopped, which was unusual for him. He started again. What should I expect? Aldous looked at him carefully. He's thin. He looks older than he is. He may be emotional. Azkaban affects people's emotional regulation, and seeing you after 5 years of not knowing, he paused. Just be yourself. That's what I always do, Harry said, which was entirely true and delivered without any arrogance, just fact. Aldous opened the door. Sirius was sitting up in the bed, which told Miriam he'd made the deliberate effort to be sitting rather than lying down, which told her something about his priorities. He was thin, Aldus's warning had been accurate, with the gaunt quality of someone who had been missing something essential for a long time, not just food but something more fundamental. His hair was long and tangled and his face had the particular quality of someone older than his age, the Azkaban quality, the hollowing. But his eyes were grey and clear and entirely present, and they found Harry the moment the door opened with the focus of something that had been waiting a very long time. Harry walked in. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Sirius, and Sirius looked at him, and the room was very quiet. "You look like James," Sirius said. His voice was rougher than it should have been for a man of 26. "And Lily." "Mostly James, but you've got her eyes." He paused. "I'd know you anywhere." "I don't remember you," Harry said, which was honest and not unkind. "But I know about you. Miriam told me. And Amelia." "Good things, I hope," Sirius said, and there was something there, the ghost of something that had once been easy and quick, a humor that 5 years hadn't killed entirely, just made quieter. "True things," Harry said. "Amelia doesn't do good, she does accurate." Sirius's mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "That's Amelia." He looked at Harry for a long moment, and his jaw worked slightly. "I didn't know," he said. "What was happening to you? I need you to know that." "If I had," he stopped. "Started again. I would have burned the world down." "I know," Harry said. "You can't possibly, you asked if I was actually safe before you asked about anything else," Harry said. "Before you asked about yourself or about getting out or about any of it. That's not nothing." He came around the side of the bed and sat down in the visitor's chair, which he pulled slightly closer, and looked at Sirius straight on. "I'm not angry at you." Sirius looked at him. Something in his face was doing several things at once. "You should be," Sirius said. "I left you, you were arrested," Harry said. "For something you didn't do." "That's not leaving." He paused, and for a moment looked exactly his age, not calculating, not assessing, just a 6-year-old sitting in a hospital room saying something he'd thought about. "You were put somewhere terrible based on someone's decision and nobody checked and nobody fixed it. 4-5 years. He met Sirius's eyes. "That happened to me too. It's not the same but it's the same kind of thing." Sirius stared at him. "I want us to know each other," Harry said. "I think we should. But not because you owe me something and not because I need someone to feel guilty about me. Just because," he paused. "Because you knew my parents and I didn't, and because you're apparently who they wanted from me, and because that seems worth knowing about." The room was entirely quiet. Miriam, who had positioned herself tactfully near the door and was directing her attention at the wall and failing completely, heard Sirius make a sound that wasn't quite a word and then recover himself. "All right," Sirius said, after a moment. His voice was rough but steady. "All right." "Yeah." "Good," Harry said. "Aldous says you need to eat more. He told me before we came in. So when you get out you should come for dinner." "Miriam makes, actually, I make dinner," he amended, with the precision of someone who took accuracy seriously. "She makes tea and I make dinner because she taught me and I got better at it than her quite quickly." Miriam looked at the wall and did not say anything. "You cook," Sirius said, and there was something lighter in it now, something that wasn't quite the weight from before. "I had to learn fast," Harry said, with the complete straightforward honesty that characterized everything he said, and which landed, as it always did, heavier than its tone suggested. "But I actually like it now. It's chemistry." Sirius absorbed that. He looked at this small, precise, extraordinary child who was James's face and Lily's eyes and also something else entirely, something that hadn't existed before, and Miriam could see him filing it all the same way Harry filed everything, carefully, and in the right place. "Okay," Sirius said. "Dinner." "Yeah." "Saturday," Harry said. "If your healers say you can flew." "I'll make them say yes," Sirius said. "Don't make them," Harry said. Just ask properly. Healers are easier if you ask properly. He glanced at Miriam with the trace of a look that she interpreted as "you see what I did there," and which she ignored with the dignity of a professional. "Right," Sirius said. "Ask properly." He looked at Harry for another long moment. "I'm going to be all right, you know. It'll take time, but, I know," Harry said, without the reassurance voice, without the gentle certainty you used when you weren't sure. "Just I know, direct and quiet. I can tell." Sirius looked at him. "How?" "Your eyes," Harry said. "They're in the room. Some people's aren't, after bad things. Yours are." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "Your mother used to say things like that." Harry looked at him. "Tell me," he said. "What she was like. What they were both like." He settled back slightly in the chair, and for the first time since Miriam had known him, Harry Potter looked like he was going to simply listen, not analyze, not file, not calculate, just receive something. Sirius cleared his throat. He looked at the window, and then back at Harry, and he started talking. Miriam stepped out into the corridor and closed the door gently behind her. Saturday came. Sirius came with it, having convinced Aldous, who had held out until Friday afternoon before agreeing to a trial float trip with specific conditions about rest and duration. He arrived in Miriam's fireplace at 5 o'clock, slightly ashy and slightly unsteady on his feet, and he stood in her sitting room and looked around at the books and the mismatched furniture and the 8 small light spheres that were doing slow orbits around Harry, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a tea towel over his shoulder. "Those are mine," Harry said, of the spheres, before Sirius could ask. "They just do that. Come in." Sirius came in. He sat on the sofa, which he sank into with the gratitude of someone who had been sleeping on hospital beds for a week. He looked at the spheres with the expression of someone who had seen plenty of magic in his life and was still recalibrating for this magic. "What are they?" he asked. "Ambient constructs," Harry said, going back into the kitchen. "Okafor says they're a continuous expression of magical state. I say they're just there." "They're very organized," Sirius said, watching them orbit. "I've been practicing the patterns," Harry said, from the kitchen. "I can do a constellation now. Orion." Appropriate, apparently, given. He came back with a glass of water and put it on the table in front of Sirius. "Given your name." Sirius took the glass. He looked at Harry. "You did your research," he said. "I do research on everything," Harry said. "Dinner's at 7. I'm making pasta because it's easy," and Aldous said nothing too heavy. "You read my dietary notes." "Miriam has copies of everything," Harry said. "I live here." Sirius looked at the kitchen doorway through which Harry had already disappeared again, and then at Miriam, who was coming downstairs. Sirius started. "Yes," Miriam said. "He doesn't, no," Miriam said. "Is he always, every single day?" Miriam said. "Tea." Dinner was good. Harry had been cooking for 2 weeks with the focused application he gave everything, and pasta, as he had noted, was straightforward chemistry, and he served it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had produced the correct result. Sirius ate 2 full bowls of it and looked, by the end, considerably less gaunt than he'd looked at 5 o'clock. They talked about James and Lily, because Harry asked questions and Sirius answered them, and the answers were real answers, not careful, curated summaries but actual things, specific and textured. James's chronic inability to arrive anywhere on time. Lily's habit of writing in books, not the margins but directly over passages she disagreed with, enormous decisive X's through whole paragraphs. The two of them arguing, which they did regularly and with great energy and which had always resolved itself within an hour because they were both constitutionally incapable of sustained grievance with each other. Harry listened to all of it with that new quality he'd had in the hospital room, not filing, just receiving. Occasionally he asked a follow-up question, small and specific, that took Sirius further into the memory. At one point Sirius said, laughing at a story about James at an Order of the Phoenix meeting, and your father just looked at Dumbledore and said with respect, "Sir, that's the worst plan I've heard since the last one," and everyone went completely silent. Harry laughed. It was the first time Miriam had heard him actually laugh, not the trace of something, not the contained almost smile, but an actual laugh, brief and genuine and a bit surprised, as though it caught him off guard. He recovered quickly and picked up his fork again, but the sound had been real, and the sphere nearest to his head went briefly, brilliantly bright. Sirius noticed. He looked at the sphere, and then at Harry, and he smiled, the real kind, the one that temporarily removed 5 years from his face. "Your mum had a laugh like that," he said. "Just sort of, arrived without warning." Harry looked at his pasta. The sphere settled back to its usual brightness. "She sounds like someone I'd like," he said. "You'd have loved each other," Sirius said. "She'd have thought you were extraordinary and she'd have been absolutely infuriating about it, she'd have pushed you on everything, never let you coast, always wanted more." He paused, and something moved through his face, the grief shifting and resettling. "She was like that with everyone she loved." Harry nodded. Slow and careful, the way he nodded when something went into the right drawer and stayed there. After dinner Harry went to bed at 9, which was his time, and Miriam and Sirius sat in the sitting room with tea and the fire going because August evenings in magical London were, despite everything, unreliable, and Sirius looked into the fire for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "His magic." "Yes," Miriam said. "It's not," he paused. "It's not like anything I've felt since James and Lily, and even he stopped. "I did a lot of magic at school. I was an Auror. I've been around powerful witches and wizards my whole life. His is different." "I know," Miriam said. "Different how?" Sirius asked, and it wasn't a challenge, he genuinely wanted her framing, the medical framing, the thing that put language to what he was feeling. "We don't fully know yet," she said honestly. "His core is larger than anything on our diagnostic scale. His precision without a wand is beyond mute level and he's 6 with no training. The ambient constructs are continuous and apparently self-sustaining. And since we removed the charms, it's been growing." She looked at the fire. "Not out of control. Not dangerous. But growing. Like a muscle," Sirius said. "Like something that's never been able to grow before and is now catching up," Miriam said. Sirius was quiet for a moment. "They tried to stop that," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. Because they were afraid of it." "I think so," she said. "I think someone looked at a 14-month-old child with that core and decided the safest thing was to make it smaller." She paused. "They were wrong. And not just morally. Practically wrong. You can't cage something like that indefinitely. They were always going to run out of charms." Sirius nodded slowly. He looked at the ceiling, toward where Harry's room was. "His parents would have," he stopped. "Tried again. They would have known what to do. With someone like him. James was never afraid of extraordinary things and Lily understood magic at a level most people." He stopped again. The grief was there, but it wasn't incapacitating. It was the older, duller kind, the kind that had settled in. "You'll learn," Miriam said. "What to do with him. It's mostly just," she paused, finding the honest version. "Mostly it's just not getting in his way, and making sure he eats enough, and answering questions. He asks a lot of questions." "I noticed," Sirius said, with the ghost of the quick smile. "But they're always real questions," she said. "He's never asking just to talk. If he asks, he wants the answer." She looked at the fire. It's very easy, in a way. Once you know that." Sirius held his tea mug in both hands, which were still slightly too thin, and looked at the fire, and Miriam watched him sitting in the warmth of a real fire in a real house with food in him and a 6-year-old asleep upstairs and thought that intact was exactly the right word, and that intact was, under the circumstances, extraordinary. When do you think the guardianship will be formal? He asked. Gringotts should certify by end of month, Miriam said. It'll be the fastest processing they've done in a century, because Ragnarok personally flagged it, which I'm told is approximately the equivalent of God writing urgent on something. Sirius almost smiled. And after that? After that, legally, it's yours, Miriam said. You'll need housing suitable for a child and you'll need to complete the Gringotts registry process and you'll need to satisfy the secondary guardian clause, which is Ragnarok, Sirius said. Which is Gringotts institutionally, she said, but yes, Ragnarok is the named signatory, which means he takes a personal interest. He'll want to meet you. I've met him, Sirius said. Years ago. Or business. He paused. He's not what most people think. No, Miriam agreed. Sirius nodded. He put his tea down. He looked toward the ceiling again. I'm going to do it right, he said. It wasn't a promise to her, it was something more internal, something being said aloud because saying it aloud made it more real. I know I'm not, he stopped, restarted. I know I'm not in a good state yet. I know it's going to take time. But I'm going to be, I want to be someone he can rely on. You already are, Miriam said. From what he told me about your hospital visit, you already are. Sirius looked at her. He said your eyes were in the room, she said. He said that means something. Sirius was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Yeah, he said, eventually. Yeah, okay. September arrived and with it the particular shift of the wizarding world's attention toward the new academic year, the crowds in Diagon Alley, the owls carrying school letters, the seasonal hum of a society organizing itself around Hogwarts the way it always did. Harry watched this from a distance, still a year too young for even preliminary Hogwarts preparation, and watched it with an interest that was half observation and half calculation. He'd been to Diagon Alley twice now. The first time with Miriam, to get his Gringotts registration formalized, Ragnarok had greeted him at the door of the bank personally, which had caused every goblin in the lobby to look up simultaneously, and Harry had greeted him back with the same calm directness he used with everyone and they had conducted the registration in Ragnarok's office in 40 minutes with Sharpclaw taking notes and the Potter and Black vaults formally opened in Harry's name for the first time. Harry had stood in the vault, the Potter vault, high in the upper levels, stone and golden torchlight and stacks of gold and parchment and objects under glass, and he had looked at it for a moment. Then he'd said, "Can I donate some of it?" Ragnarok had looked at him. To whom? Families who can't afford Hogwarts supplies, Harry said. Or medical care at St Mungo's. Something like that. He'd looked at the vault. There's more here than I'll ever need. Especially with the black account too. Ragnarok had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, yes. You can establish a charitable trust. Sharpclaw will draft the framework. Not in my name, Harry said. I don't want it to be about me. Just, where it's needed. Sharpclaw had stopped writing and looked at Ragnarok. Ragnarok had looked at Harry. Anonymous, Harry said. Is that possible? It is, Ragnarok said. We're a bank. Discretion is foundational. Then that, Harry said, and turned from the vault. That's what I want to do with some of it. The charitable trust was established that week. It was, per Harry's specific instruction, anonymous. It was also, per Ragnarok's specific edition, administered by a Gringotts Oversight Committee, because he trusted Harry's intentions entirely and the Ministry's administrative competence not at all. The second Diagon Alley visit was with Sirius, who had been officially discharged from St Mungo's and was living in a rented flat in magical London while the legal and practical preparations for a proper home were underway. They'd gone for books, primarily, because Harry had worked through Miriam's study with alarming speed and needed resupply, and because Flourish and Blots was, in Harry's considered opinion, the best shop in Diagon Alley by a significant margin. They'd spent 2 hours in it. Sirius had sat on a stool in the middle of the shop and watched Harry navigate the shelves with systematic thoroughness and thought, visibly, many things, and had bought himself 3 books he didn't need because being in a bookshop with someone who was genuinely delighted by books turned out to be contagious. On the way out, a witch had recognized Harry. Not Sirius, Harry, which meant the Prophet's coverage had done its work and his face was known in a way that was going to be an ongoing feature of his life. She'd stopped in the street and said, "Oh, you're Harry Potter, aren't you?" with the particular reverence of someone addressing something they'd built up in their head. Harry had said, yes, pleasantly and without stopping, which was, Sirius had told Miriam later, the correct response and also completely characteristic, and they'd walked on while the witch stood on the pavement with the look of someone who had expected more ceremony and gotten none. "Does that happen a lot?" Sirius had asked. "About once per visit," Harry had said. "I think it'll slow down once I'm less current." "People have been calling you the boy who lived since you were 15 months old," Sirius said. "I don't think it slows down." Harry had considered this. "Then I'll get better at the response," he'd said, as though it were a skill to be refined rather than a burden to be borne. Sirius had looked at him for a moment. "Your dad used to say something like that," he'd said. "About Quidditch. When people in the street would stop him after a match. He'd say, 'I'll practice the wave.'" His voice had done the thing it still did sometimes, the catch. He meant it as a joke. "I don't think you're joking." "Both," Harry had said. "I can mean it and it can still be funny." Sirius had laughed. The real kind, sudden and surprised, and Harry had looked very briefly pleased with himself before going back to the book he'd already opened while they walked, which was dangerous and impressive in equal measure. The formal guardianship was certified by Gringotts on September the 3rd. Miriam was there, as secondary signatory for the transition period. Sirius was there, thin and present and with his eyes fully in the room. Ragnarok was there, personally, which everyone understood was not standard procedure and which was therefore a statement. Amelia Bones came as the DMLE witness, which was standard procedure, and she brought with her the Wisengamot's formal notation that the legal guardianship was recognized and registered, which meant it existed in both the Goblin Nation's records and the Ministry's, simultaneously, with both sets of protections. Harry sat at the table in Ragnarok's office and read every line of the certification document before he signed it, which nobody rushed him on. When he signed, Ragnarok said, quietly, not for the room, but for Harry, "The accord is satisfied." Harry looked at him. "The accord is a start," he said. Ragnarok's mouth moved in the way that was his version of a smile. "Yes," he said. "It is." After the signing was done and the document was sealed and the room was transitioning from formal to social, Amelia came to stand beside Harry while Sirius talked with Ragnarok about something practical involving housing in a magically protected area. "How do you feel?" she asked, which was becoming something of a recurring question between them. "Like something is beginning," Harry said. He looked at the sealed document on Ragnarok's desk. "Not finishing. I thought I'd feel more like something was finishing, but it doesn't feel like that." "Things rarely do," Amelia said. "The beginning of something usually just looks like the end of something else." Harry considered this. "Is Dumbledore being investigated?" "Still." "Yes," Amelia said. "The investigation into the original charm application is ongoing. We have Petunia's description, and that's opened a line that we're following carefully." She paused. "It will take time. But it won't close." "I don't need it to be fast," Harry said. "I need it to be thorough." "It will be," Amelia said. She said it the way she said things that she meant, without performance, without the cushion of reassurance, just the flat certainty of someone who had decided. "I know," Harry said. The new house was a narrow, tall building in a magically concealed street in London, the kind of street that existed in the space between two other streets and was only visible to those who knew it was there. It had 4 floors, which was more than they needed, but Sirius had chosen it partly for the roof terrace and partly because it had a library room on the 3rd floor that was empty and waiting, and which Harry had walked into on the first viewing and stood in for 30 seconds and then turned around and looked at Sirius with an expression so clear and unguarded that Sirius had said done to the estate agent before Harry could say anything at all. They moved in on the 15th. Miriam came to help, which primarily meant supervising the magical transport of boxes, while Sirius swore at furniture that hadn't come with assembly instructions, and Harry sat in the library room on the floor surrounded by unpacked books and arranged them by subject with a concentration so complete that he was effectively somewhere else. At one point Miriam found Sirius standing in the doorway of the library room watching Harry build his shelving system and wearing the expression of someone who was learning how to hold something large without dropping it. She stood beside him. "He's going to fill that room in a year," Sirius said quietly. 18 months at most, Miriam said. Sirius looked at her. "He's going to be extraordinary." "He already is," Miriam said. "You said that." "I know," Sirius said. "I keep saying it because he paused. "Because I keep catching myself thinking about what he would have been like if none of this had happened. If James and Lily had lived, if he'd grown up, normal." He looked at Harry, who was cross-legged on the floor arranging books with the 8 spheres orbiting serenely overhead, lighting the shelves. "I don't know if he'd have been this. He'd have been something else," Miriam said. "Different. Not less." She looked at Harry too. "What he is partly what was done to him. Some of it, the precision, the self-sufficiency, the way he reads people, that came from needing to, because nobody was reliable. You can't separate that out." She paused. "But the core of it, the clarity, the fairness, the way he moves toward things instead of away, that was always there. They couldn't charm that away. They tried." Sirius was quiet for a moment. 71 times, he said, softly. 71 times, Miriam said. And it was still there on the other side. Inside the room, Harry looked up from his books. He looked at both of them in the doorway with the clear green eyes and the perfectly even expression. "Are you going to help," he said, "or are you going to watch?" Sirius pushed off from the doorframe. "Help," he said. "Obviously." "Then come sort the transfiguration section," Harry said. "I can't decide if it goes before or after charms, and you've actually taken the classes." "Before," Sirius said, coming into the room. "Transfiguration is foundational. Charms build on, that's what I thought," Harry said, rearranging. "But Okafor said charms first is more intuitive for natural casters." "Okafor hasn't seen your transfiguration potential yet," Sirius said, sitting down on the floor beside him and reaching for a stack of books. "No," Harry said. "But he will." He said it with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact about the future that they had already, in some fundamental way, decided. Not arrogance. Not bravado. Just Harry, sitting in his library in his house with his spheres and his books and his godfather next to him on the floor, knowing exactly what he was and exactly where he was going. Miriam sat on the other side and picked up a stack of healing texts that had somehow ended up in the pile. "These are mine," she said. "I was going to read them," Harry said. "You're 6, she said. "I'm aware," he said. "They're medical textbooks," she said. "I know," he said. "I started the first one on Tuesday." She looked at him. He looked back at her, entirely composed, and then at Sirius, and Sirius looked at Miriam, and the 3 of them sat on the floor of the library room in the new house in the concealed London street with books surrounding them in every direction and the 8 spheres making their slow, steady orbits overhead, and then Sirius started laughing, the real kind, the sudden kind, and Harry looked briefly, genuinely delighted, and Miriam sat there with her medical textbooks and thought that this was improbably and completely going to be all right. Not the soft kind. The structural kind. The real kind. The Wisingamott's formal record of the proceedings was published at the end of September, as it always was, the bound annual volume distributed to every member and held in the ministry archives, the legal and political history of the year set down in permanent ink. The entry for August was the longest in 40 years. It ran to 31 pages and covered the Dursley trial, the Accord settlement, the censure vote, the exoneration of Sirius Black, and the formal registration of Harry Potter's guardianship under Gringotts certified protections. Ragnarok received his copy by Goblin courier, as all official Wisengamot publications were distributed. He read the August section in his office, 6 levels below the lobby, at the clear dark desk with the cold white lights overhead, and when he was done he closed it and placed it in a new section of the filing cases, not pending, not active, not any of the categories that preceded it. The new label read, in gobbledygook, precedent. Because that was what it was. Every clause of the August settlement, every certified protection, every procedural precedent, all of it now existed in the permanent record in a form that could be cited, built on, extended. Harry's case had changed the architecture. Not all of it. Not permanently and irreversibly, because nothing was permanent and nothing was irreversible, and Ragnarok had lived long enough to know that institutions pushed back, that power recalibrated, that whatever was built now would be tested later. But the building had begun. He sat in his office and thought about a 6-year-old in a Muggle hospital side room, eating a sandwich at speed, looking at him with those green eyes and asking, why? He thought about what he'd said. Both. He thought that was still the truest answer he'd given in 20 years of politics. He picked up his pen and began working on the next thing. In October, Hogwarts sent Harry Potter a letter. Not an admissions letter. He was years from that. It was a letter from the headmaster's office, written in a hand that Miriam recognized when Harry brought it downstairs, the purple ink and the careful loops of someone who had been writing letters for a very long time. Harry sat at the kitchen table and read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and looked at it. Miriam poured tea and waited. He wants to meet, Harry said. When I'm ready. No pressure. No agenda. Just, to speak with me. She sat down across from him. She looked at the letter, at the purple ink. What do you want to do? She asked. Harry looked at the letter for a long moment. He picked it up again, read one section a third time, and set it back down. I'll meet him, he said. Eventually. Not yet. He paused. He needs to be someone I choose to meet, not someone I have to deal with. There's a difference. There is, Miriam agreed. And there are things I want to know before I do, Harry said. Things the investigation will find, if it's thorough. Things that will help me understand what he actually believed versus what he decided was convenient. He looked up. I'm not going to meet him until I know enough to have a real conversation instead of a managed one. That could take years, Miriam said. That's fine, Harry said. I'm 7 in July. I have time. She looked at him. He looked back at her, those green eyes entirely even, and then he got up from the table, put the letter on the stack of things that needed filing, and went to the kitchen to start making breakfast. She listened to him move around, the deliberate sounds of someone who had learned to cook as a survival mechanism and had turned it into something else, something chosen, something his own. Pans and water and the particular quiet competence of it. The 8 spheres drifted through the kitchen doorway after him, steady as anything. Outside the window, London was doing its October thing, grey and gold and particular, the light thin but present, the city enormous and indifferent and continuing, as cities did, regardless. Miriam sat at the table with her tea. She thought about the Tuesday in September 2 years from now when she'd be a witness at Harry's Hogwarts induction. She thought about what the Hogwarts professors were going to do when they encountered a 9-year-old who had been reading healing textbooks for recreation and had a self-sustaining magical construction running continuously out of the corner of his unconscious mind. She thought about what would happen when he walked into his first charms class and the teacher said point your wand and give it a flick and Harry looked at the wand and looked at the object and simply moved the object. She thought about Ragnarok's note that morning, a brief one, just 2 lines, informing her that the anonymous charitable trust had processed its first disbursement and that 47 wizarding families who couldn't afford Hogwarts tuition materials had received full supply grants without knowing from whom. She thought about Sirius, 1 floor up, asleep, slowly getting stronger, learning the weight of normalcy the way someone relearned walking, uncertain at first, then steadier, then one day not thinking about it. She thought about Harry in the hospital room on the first morning with his toast and his green eyes, asking, "Can you fix it?" She'd said, "I already started." She had started. All of them had started. Ragnarok, and Amelia, and Sirius, and Harry himself, especially Harry himself, who had arrived at this with nothing but his own clarity and had built outward from there with the same patient, precise, unafraid momentum that apparently came from being who he was. He wasn't finished. Not remotely. He was 7 years old and he had decades of this ahead of him, the learning, the growing, the inevitable conflict with a world that had already tried once to make him smaller and would try again in different forms, because power always did, because the world was full of people who looked at something that large and felt afraid. But afraid was their problem. From the kitchen came the sound of breakfast nearly ready, and the smell of it, and Harry saying, not to her, to no one in particular, or possibly to the spheres, "Scrambled, I think." And that was, Miriam thought, exactly the right ending and exactly not an ending at all. She got up to set the table.